Welcome to Beyond Foundations. My name is Dean VanEvery, the associate pastor here at Grand Avenue Baptist Church. So, what we're doing here, these are not new. This is not new content that we're putting up on the podcast here. Basically, I have combined the lessons that we walked through the Old Testament and just kind of wanted to put them in a few places instead of 21 different lessons, 21 different podcast episodes, to have them as 4 or 5 episodes here. So I've combined several into one long recording, so you can kind of listen to them more like you would an audiobook than just kind of a bunch of episodes that you kind of have to go chase down one after the other. So if you've already listened to all these, don't feel like there's it's just the same recordings put back up in kind of packaged together. So don't feel like you need to go back and listen through them. You're more than welcome to if you'd like to review or do whatever else. But just let you know, these are the same recordings, just kind of packaged together. So this one we'll do Genesis. I think I'll get through Kings on this one, so it'll be the first several, and then we'll have a few more to follow, and hopefully, get into 4 or 5. I'll see how it turns out. Anyways, here we go. Lesson 1, Genesis. Okay, welcome to Grand Avenue Baptist Church. Welcome to Foundations. My name is Dean VanEvery. I'm recording this after already finishing the whole Old Testament project. I'm recording this here in December. I'm going back and re-recording, or I guess recording for the first time, some of the earlier lessons from our Old Testament series. So I just finished up working through the entire Old Testament in our Foundations class, our adult Sunday school class that follows the Sunday service. So we didn't record the first 4 lessons. I'm eventually going to go back and record each of those. So this is the same notes, same content. I'm not like redoing all the research that I did for it. So I'm just going to be working back through the lessons that we went through back at the beginning of the year, back in this past, I think February it must have been. So this is not the original lesson, but we're going to be working through the content just to kind of get all the content up there online. We're gonna start with Genesis. Start with Genesis today. We'll do Genesis today, or in this lesson, and then Exodus will be another one, and then we'll do Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Those 3 will be one, and then Joshua and Judges will be one lesson, and then that should catch us up back to the recordings that are already on the podcast. I'm excited to get to kind of go back and just rethink about some of these, because again, I'm not doing fresh research on these things, but I am, bringing the rest of the research that I've done since this time, right? So I did the work on this one on Genesis about a year ago, and then covered the rest of the Old Testament. And so now, nothing really crazy that I wasn't aware of that got brought to light, but there are certainly things that got deepened, and certainly understandings of mine that were sharpened and tweaked and reinforced in some ways. And so, just excited to kind of have another swing at these books. Anyways, so these earlier lessons were a little bit more tightly structured, kind of around four basic, I don't even know what to call them, just themes that I would hit on each lesson. So the first one was always just the book structure. How is this book divided? That carried through the rest of the lessons all the way through the Old Testament. But then in these early ones, I would break out 3 specific themes that I wanted to look at, what each book said about them. What does this book say about God? What does this book say about redemption? Kind of who is Jesus? What is the gospel? Those kinds of things. And then what were some application points from this book? Towards the end, especially in the second semester, once we got out of the narrative books, those kind of converged more or less into basically just the question of what are some of the major themes. Really, that was meant, that move to more just kind of a major themes idea, was meant to just let me be a little bit more sensitive to just what each book kind of wants to say for itself, as far as what things it emphasizes, what things it doesn't emphasize. So that just opened up a little bit more flexibility for me. But whether we were doing God, redemption, application, or just kind of hitting major themes, we still were basically seeing some of the same elements. That was kind of the major ideas that the Old Testament just keeps pushing in front of us. Is just it has a lot to say about God, about man, about man's history, his destiny, what God is doing in the world, about who Jesus is, the Redeemer He's going to send into the world, and what He's going to accomplish when He is sent into the world. And it's very applicable, right? It's everywhere throughout the Old Testament has a lot to say about what it looks like to fear the Lord, what it looks like to live rightly before your Maker, before your Redeemer. So, anyways, just with that kind of high level overview, that's what this whole project is, of this Old Testament survey, this Old Testament overview. We're looking at, yeah, what does this book, the Old Testament, and this collection of books, the books of the Old Testament, well, what does this say about God? What does this say about man, his history, his destiny? What does this say about Christ and the plan of redemption, the purposes of redemption? What does this say about how we should live today and tomorrow and the rest of our lives? So that's what we see in each of these books, each of these lessons. So today I'll just jump into Genesis and we'll get started from there. So Genesis, it's the first book in the Bible, and that word Genesis, the title of it just comes from the Greek word for beginning, right? So it's just the beginning, right? It's named after the first word in the book, which it says in the beginning, right? So Genesis, it's important. It's the first book. It starts the story. It lays the foundations, and that's a lot of the themes that we're going to trace through the entire Old Testament. They find their origin here in Genesis. They find their foundations here in Genesis. At the just recently, but in the last lesson, finishing up the book of the 12, I gave the illustration of that the Old Testament kind of builds its themes, builds its composition, something like a fugue, where there's kind of a simple theme that starts the composition, and then you add another theme, another simple theme, another simple theme, another simple theme, until as you're adding these simple themes together, you build this complex, masterpiece of a composition. And so where the Minor Prophets is kind of at the height of the complexity, the height of the climax of it all, Genesis is the fairly simple beginnings. Genesis is the humble, lowly, simple, almost just very straightforward beginnings of these themes that we're going to tease out in the rest of the Old Testament. So this is where you start. This is where you set the trajectories. And even this is there are four books in the Old Testament that are or I guess, the four most common books that are quoted in the New Testament. Genesis is one of them. Of the top four books in the Old Testament that the New Testament authors quote, Genesis is one of them. I believe the others are Deuteronomy, Isaiah, and the Psalms. So Genesis, Deuteronomy, Isaiah, and the Psalms, kind of your I don't know, tent pegs of books in the Old Testament. So Genesis lays the foundations. Genesis sets the trajectories, says this is the story we're telling, this is where we're going to be going. So a quick note on, or maybe not so quick, but just a note on the structure of Genesis. There's kind of four major chunks, in the book of Genesis, all roughly 11 to 13 chapters long. So there's 50 chapters total, and so each of these major chunks is a little bit over 10 chapters. So the first one is basically global history. The first 11 chapters, chapter 1 through 11, this covers a couple thousand years and details the beginnings, not just of the line of Israel, not just of the human race, but of creation itself. Really, there's lots of ways you can look at it. But honestly, there's just no there's just no way to look at this and not see this as some kind of a fairly straightforward historical account. This is God telling us what actually happened at the very beginnings of the human race. Where did we come from? What's the very beginnings of our history? There's just no good reason to read this as anything other than just ancient history, straight up. So these first 11 chapters, chapter 1, you get the creation account. Chapters 2 through 3, you get what's called the account of the fall, where man fell into sin. Chapters 6 through 9, skipping a little bit there, but chapters 6 through 9, that's where you're going to get Noah's flood, right? That's where you're going to get the story of Noah and his ark. That's where you're going to get the story of, just that period in world history. And then chapter 11 is the Tower of Babel. And that has some historical, or that has significant implications for the structure of the rest of the Bible, because basically what the story of the Bible is doing is showing how God is reconciling all peoples to himself, and is calling all peoples to himself, to have one Lord and one God and one King and one Master under him, under the Lord Jesus Christ. And at Babel, that's kind of really where that really gets dispersed, because that's the account of where we get the origin of different languages. Where before this story, and you can go read it for yourself in chapter 11 there, before this event, all mankind spoke one common language. But after this, they were scattered. And this, leads to all the chaos and conflict and bloodshed just from that kind of misunderstanding. So this is basically the kind of final ripping apart of human history, that then the rest of the scripture details how the Lord stitches this back together, not just by putting band-aids on it, but by renewing us. Paul talks about this as being, in place of two, Jews and Gentiles, God is making one new man by tearing down the dividing wall of hostility that was erected between them. So this is Babel, or again, this is the foundation. This is the trajectory. This is where the story of the scriptures starts. So that's just hugely foundational. This is obviously the story of Adam and Eve comes from here. So this is the foundation, the bedrock, the beginning. These first 11 chapters, kind of the global history, really cosmic history of basically laying out what our problem is. Right. This is again where we get the whole idea of sin, the whole problem of what God is trying to solve, or what God is solving in and through Jesus Christ. So that's kind of your first major chunk in Genesis, chapters 1 through 11. And then 12 through 50, chapters 12 through chapter 50, it slows down a lot to just zoom in on basically four generations of the family of Abraham. So Abraham, he's a hugely significant figure in human history and world history in the scriptures here. So we meet Abraham in chapter 12, and basically chapter 12 through 23, it's about 11 chapters again. Chapter 12 through 23 covers the story of Abraham. Um, and then chapters 24 through 26 talks about Isaac, kind of gives the story of Isaac, who's Abraham's son. And there's some reason why that might be so much shorter, but he doesn't seem to really get a spotlight shown on him. He almost kind of seems to be almost an interlude between major characters. He gets about 3 chapters, and then Jacob gets 10 chapters, right? So I think he kind of fills out this second section. So the second section the first section is global history. Second section is Abraham, chapters 12 through 23. And then the third section seems to be chapter 24 through 36. It's basically Isaac and Jacob, with 10 of those 13 chapters being Jacob, right? So Jacob kind of being the major character of that section. And then the fourth and final section is 37 through 50, which is again 14 chapters. And that's all about the story of Joseph, one of Jacob's sons. So Abraham, his son Isaac, his son Jacob, and then one of his 12 sons is Joseph. And so Joseph is kind of the main character of the last 14 chapters of Genesis. So the way that I see that, really, so there's basically 3 sections, and each of those 3 men and their stories seems to emphasize something about what God is trying to teach us about the unfolding story of human history and even of redemptive history. So Abraham is often called the man of faith, or something to that effect. And so in Abraham, you see both a picture of what it looks like to believe God, to trust God, and especially to patiently wait on God's promises. And so in the story of Abraham, the main thing that God is showing us is his faithfulness, that he makes these promises. And even though it takes a long time, even though it feels to us like it's taking way too long, God is faithful, that he is not slow in fulfilling his promises. So then I think that the couple of chapters on Isaac, they're important because basically they show that this Isaac is the fulfillment of this promise. But then he gets into Jacob, and Jacob, he's an interesting character because he's not a righteous man. He's not held up as hey, this is a really good example of what it means to be a good God-fearing man. He tricks his dad. He deceives and tricks his brother. He runs away from home and deceives and tricks his uncle. Right? He's not held up as a paragon of virtue. And yet, I think he's zeroed in on, and his story is emphasized in such a way to help us to, right from the beginning, get the picture that God is in the business of pursuing and working through justified sinners. Justified sinners. That Jacob isn't held up as this is what it looks like to be a good, noble, godly man. Though he certainly becomes that. He certainly becomes that. He's primarily, it seems to be primarily held up as this is what it looks like to be a sinner who is redeemed, who is justified. So we see God's faithfulness with Abraham, and we see God's grace, God's justifying grace with Jacob. And then with Joseph, he's very famously has a hard go of it. So he is basically sold into slavery by his brothers when he's young, and then is falsely accused of a horrible crime and is thrown in jail for several years. But then the Lord uses him to interpret some dreams, and he's exalted to the right hand of the Pharaoh in Egypt, and God uses him to save not just Egypt, but even the whole line of his family, the promised, the line that the promised deliverer is going to come from. He uses Joseph to save them, right? So it's this huge turnaround from tragedy after tragedy after tragedy to finally God exalts him. God pulls him out of prison and puts him at the right hand of the throne of Pharaoh. So there's, Christological, there's Jesus echoes in there. But really, just at a simple level, we see there the sufferer who is redeemed. The sufferer who is redeemed. Right? We saw Abraham, the man of faith, Jacob, the sinner justified, and then in Joseph we see the sufferer who is redeemed. And kind of paralleling with that, with Abraham, the man of faith, we see God's faithfulness. With Jacob, the sinner justified, we see God's grace, and with Joseph, the sufferer redeemed, we see God's sovereignty. We see God's sovereignty. So in these four generations, especially these three kind of major characters in this book of Genesis, what this book is trying to set up for us as we kind of launch into the Old Testament is that we should see kind of God's covenant promises, right? Didn't really touch on that. Didn't really touch on that so much, but his covenant promises when we fall into sin, when we eat the fruit, fall into sin, God curses the serpent, says that a man is going to come, Eve, from you. Who's going to crush this serpent, right? So these covenant promises of redemption of the human race, this starts to get narrowed down into the line of Abraham, the line of Jacob, into the family of Joseph. So that these covenant promises are going to be fulfilled by a God who's faithful, even though it seems like it's taken a long time, just like the promise to Abraham, that God is going to be faithful to fulfill his promises. Second, that God isn't going to work with only perfect people, but he's actually going to be in the business of justifying sinners. That this is a God of grace who justifies, who uses broken, sinful people to redeem them, restore them, teach them to walk uprightly, and to use them in his purposes. And then lastly, this God is sovereign. That even when Joseph gets thrown in the pit, he's still perfectly fulfilling God's good plan for him. So God is faithful, God is gracious, and God is sovereign. This is the message of who God is coming out of the book of Genesis. Okay, so that's kind of the structural component. That's the four major sections of the book of Genesis. Next, I'll move into kind of just some theological reflection on the book of Genesis. Basically, I have 4 points for you of what we should learn about God from the book of Genesis. First is God in creation. Second is God in history. Third is just the simple fact that God initiates, and fourth is that God works through covenants. So first, God and creation. Really, we see this throughout the book, but especially just in chapter 1. In chapter 1, the account of the 7 days of creation, or the 6 days of creation and the day of rest. So it's really what we see there, and especially as you start to kind of be aware of kind of some pagan creation myths, you start to kind of see some of the contrasts. So one big contrast that needs to be mentioned is just the singular will that you see at work in God creating the universe. That there is no kind of dueling of wills. There's no, God wanted this, but creation kind of wouldn't let him, or this other spiritual force wouldn't let him. In the creation account, it's just God willed, God said, it was. No contests, no conflicts, no struggle, no effort. There was just will and reality. The second thing that you notice about God and creation in that chapter is just that God is not a God kind of interwoven and interrelated with creation. Meaning it's not God kind of working within the system, trying to get it to conform to his will. It's God kind of in a one-directional relationship telling creation exactly what it's going to be. God conditions. God creates, conditions, modifies, directs, lords over, is master over creation, shapes creation, and creation in no way shapes or conditions God. There's a one-way relationship here between God and creation. So second, God and history. Again, the Genesis sets up for you the fact that the Bible is not a national drama. It is a global story, bringing in all nations and all people. So the story begins with all nations. It begins with Adam and Eve, not the father of the Israelites, but the father of all nations, the father of all men. So the story begins with all nations. All nations are judged in the flood, right? This isn't a local thing. This is a global, universal. All nations are judged in the flood. all nations are scattered at Babel. All nations are involved in the curse and the destructive effects of that. And ultimately, through the promises to Abraham and his offspring, all nations will be blessed through Abram's seed. Genesis 22, God explicitly says, all nations will be blessed through your seed. So God is not just kind of working to redeem a people or one people. He's working to redeem all peoples. God is sovereignly working out his plan for all of mankind through all of history. So God in creation, God in history. Third, God initiates. Right, Genesis paints a picture of a very high initiative God. God is never reacting. God is never responding to what we're doing. Creation, again, is purposeful. It's meaningful. It's a free act. It's not one day God felt like he had to. It's God decided. God did. God acted. God initiated. Redemption, God initiates. God comes to Abraham. Abraham at that time, he's called Abram. Abraham didn't kind of earn God's attention. He didn't get God to notice him. God just showed up to Abraham and said, "This is what you're going to do, and this is what I'm going to do through you." So God initiates. Then fourth, covenants. So this is kind of an interesting thing that you need to start to notice. This is going to be really important throughout the rest of the Old Testament. Basically, just the idea is this: God always interacts with his human creatures through covenants. God's relationship to each and every human being is a covenantal relationship. God always relates to people as covenant people. So this is with Adam. He has a certain covenant relation, to him, basically saying, "Don't eat that fruit, or you'll receive these certain covenant curses." Covenant penalties. He relates to Noah through a covenant. Relates to Abraham through a covenant. He relates to Isaac and Jacob and the rest of his sons through a covenant. So this isn't the kind of Enlightenment picture of this isolated individual that God is relating with, but there's a certain kind of a legal and covenantal idea to what it means to relate to God. So what is a covenant? A covenant, really, it's basically just this legal interpersonal relationship created through some kind of a binding agreement. Right, so there it kind of implies this legal dimension to human nature, honestly, to human nature. So Jean Rousseau was a French philosopher who did really just a ton of damage to human society through a lot of his ideas, ton of his ideas. But one of them was basically this idea of man, this kind of thought experiment of man in his state of nature, man kind of before or outside of any kind of society, any kind of social constructs, any kind of legal relationships. As man, you think of man in the jungle. And he wasn't really trying to do like a historical reconstruction. It was more of a thought experiment of kind of what is true of man, abstracted away from all these things that we see in society. But the biblical picture would be, if you abstract man outside of legal covenantal society, you've abstracted man out of his natural habitat. Out of his natural habitat. Man, according to the scriptures, is naturally covenantal, is naturally in some kind of a legal covenant relationship, not just with God, especially with God, but with God but also with each other. You see this in marriage, that immediately when God brings Eve to Adam, there's a marriage covenant pronounced. There's marriage covenant language going on. So man, in all of his most personal, most intimate, most real relationships, is covenantal. He's covenantal. So God relates to man in and through covenant because he created us to be covenant creatures. So this is both our problem, right? Our covenant relationship to Adam is kind of the big source of our problem. This is where we inherit the fall from. But it's also the source of solution. It's through covenant relation to the promised seed of Abraham, to the promised serpent crusher. It's through covenant relation to Jesus Christ that we can be justified before God because of his righteousness and his suffering and death. So covenant is the most natural relationship that we have as humans towards God, but also towards one another. Okay, so that's God. So then second, what do we learn? I guess third, structure, God, and then redemption. What does Genesis teach us about redemption? So one of the big features that you see in Genesis is a lot of genealogies, a lot of kind of just lists of so and so was the son of so and so was had this son, and then he had this son, and then he had this son, right? So it's this. It seems like it's just a lot of kind of information about family history, but really what's happening there is that it's tracing out this genealogical covenantal promise, right? If there's this promise to Eve, one of your sons is going to crush this serpent. And so you kind of need to trace that sonship. You need to trace that lineage. And then it gets to Abraham. One of your seeds, one of your offspring is going to be the blessing to all nations. So you get this transgenerational story being told that wants to trace out not just this interesting family's history, but trace out the story of redemption through this family. So a big part of what's going on in that is kind of just pressing us towards this call to patience, pressing us towards this promise that was given to Eve is going to take a long time to be fulfilled. It's going to take a long time to be fulfilled. So you need to be patient. You need to wait. This is why, and again, back to Abraham, he's held up as this example of someone who faithfully, someone who faithfully waited years, decades for the fulfillment of God's promise. So what Genesis is trying to help us to see is that this redemptive promise, this promise of a redeemer through the line of the woman, it's going to take patience. It's going to require some waiting. But then a couple of kind of specific points to note, just as far as the redemptive history that gets set up in the book of Genesis, really is a couple of promises, one at the very beginning of the book and the other at the very end of the book. So the first, I've mentioned it already, is Genesis 3:15. So I don't think I've actually told the story, told the actual story so far. But so God creates the universe, creates the world, creates mankind in the space of 6 days, and then comes to Adam and basically says, "Don't eat of this tree. If you eat of this tree, you're going to die." Then one day the serpent comes and deceives Eve. Eve takes the fruit from that forbidden tree, takes a bite of it, hands it to her husband. Adam eats. Then God comes to them and he comes to confront them and say, you did the thing that you were told not to do, the one tree that I told you not to eat from. You ate from it. Why did you do that? And so in that process, he pronounces curses. He pronounces a curse to Adam, pronounces a curse to Eve. But then within the curse to the serpent, which is interesting, within the curse to the serpent, he unfolds this promise. There's kind of this promise wrapped in this curse, where he says to you, serpent, I'm gonna create enmity. I'm gonna create animosity, opposition between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. And one day, one of her offspring is going to crush your head, and you will bruise his heel. So he gets this picture, this picture set up of this curse came into the world through this serpent, and yet this serpent is going to be crushed. It's again, think of the fugue, a very simple idea. This snake is bad. Someday someone's going to come and take care of this snake. It doesn't really spell out exactly what all that means, but as it gets fleshed out, we see that this is a promise of undoing the curse. This gets a little bit fleshed out with Abraham, when Abraham gets promised that through him there's going to be global blessing, right? Blessing and curses, those are opposites, and so there's this global curse came in through the serpent, but through the line of Abraham there's going to be global blessing, right? That is going to undo this blessing. So you start to see this kind of woven in kind of opposition and solution to, or I guess in fulfillment of Genesis 3:15, that promise of the curse, or that curse. But the second verse I want to draw your attention to is just Genesis 49 verse 10. And this is an interesting prophecy, basically of a coming king from the line of Judah. Judah being one of Jacob's sons, one of Israel's sons. So this verse comes from in the middle of a story or a time where Jacob is blessing each of his 12 sons, and he gets to Judah, and he says this in verse 10: "The scepter." Which is a picture of royal rule, of kingly authority. "The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet, until tribute comes to him, and to him shall be the obedience of the peoples." So again, you just get this prophecy that there's going to be a king in the house of Judah. Again, you don't get much done with that. It's a simple theme at this point, but there's just this prophecy of a coming king. Interestingly, we'll see that this promise and the promise to Abraham, a blessing to all nations, that his offspring will be as numerous as the sand of the sea and as many as the stars of the heavens. That promise, the verbiage of that promise, and the verbiage of the promise I just read about the scepter, gets kind of merged together in the book of Numbers, which starts to bring together these two promises: the Abrahamic promise of blessing through the offspring of Abraham, and the kingly promise. Eventually, this gets fleshed out more through David, when God promises to build a house for David, that there always be a son from the line of David to rule over the people of God. So this is where these promises start, right? They get, again, fleshed out, they get expanded, they get kind of teased out. But even in the book of Genesis, we just start to get these little nuggets, these little foundation stones that get laid out for us. Okay, so that's structure, theology, redemption. Now I want to make a few kind of just pastoral comments on application. How do we? Well, what are kind of the applicational thrusts of the book of Genesis? So the first one that comes to mind is just the idea of worship and gratitude. This idea of worship and gratitude. As you read Genesis 1, one of the thoughts that should be coming to your mind is, wow, all of this is a gift. All of this is a gift. Creation doesn't deserve to be created. I never earned the right to be born. All that I am, all that I have, all that I've ever experienced is a gift from the gracious hand of God. So that should give me awe and wonder and cause me to worship this God who's so powerful and so mighty and so glorious to be able to do all this. But then also gratitude to the God who's so gracious and kind that He would willingly do this for me, that He would give this to me. So Genesis, I mean, even just that again, first chapter should fill us with worship and gratitude. Second application is all the story, especially as you think about Abraham, or really especially as you think about Joseph, should give you trust in the middle of chaos. Should give you trust and hope and confidence in the middle of chaos. Again, whether it's you're talking about global chaos, whether you're talking about like big, where is God taking this history? What is God doing in the world? Is God really in control? Does God really have a plan for history, or even just like personal, your own personal history? Man, I just lost my job, or just had some bad thing just happened, or some personal tragedy, or even just kind of ongoing malaise, and just the chaos of your own life. The book of Genesis should remind you that God is able to work through even the darkest of situations, even the darkest and most hopeless of situations. God is still working and is still working out His covenant promises to do just exactly what He said He would do. Again, a third kind of related to that is the idea that we need to be waiting in hope, waiting in hope that God's covenant promises that what God has promised He will do often takes time and longer than we would like. Usually longer than we would like. And yet, God is still working. God is still at work to do the things that He promised to do. None of these stories were quick. Let's see. Fourth kind of application: God is in the business of redemption. God is in the business of taking broken people, saving them, redeeming them, reconciling them, drawing them to Himself. So yeah, broken people. Think about Jacob, the trickster, the one who wrestled with God. God is in the business of redeeming broken people, and He's in the business of redeeming broken situations. Think of Joseph, right? He is a pretty upstanding guy himself, but just finds himself in some bad situations. God is in the business of redeeming broken situations. And last, kind of the thing that you should be thinking about throughout the book of Genesis is just kind of the lesson that we get from Genesis 3, from the curse, from when Adam and Eve get exiled from the garden. Because the final, kind of the finishing touch of the penalty of violating God's covenant, what happened to them is that Adam and Eve were driven out of the garden, the door was locked behind them, and a big tough angel with a flaming sword was put in their way to guard the door so they couldn't come back. They were kicked out of the presence of God. They were kicked out of paradise. They were kicked out of fellowship with the living and true God. And this is the big tragedy, right? It's not the unlimited fruit. It's not the pleasant weather. Um, it's fellowship with God that was the great loss of the fall. It is right standing, right relationship with God. That's the great tragedy of the fall. So our great loss from the book of Genesis is that fellowship, is that relationship with God. But on the flip side of that, our great hope is not good circumstances. Our great hope is not wealth, it's not health, it's not security. Right? These can be very good things that God gives to His people. God has a lot to say about those things in His Word, but the great hope of the Christian is that we would be reconciled to God, that we would be allowed back into the presence of God. And the rest of the Bible unfolds and shows us that it's only through Jesus Christ that we can do this. It's only through the serpent crusher, whose heel is bruised by the serpent. He suffers horribly to pay for our redemption. But in the end, our redemption comes from His blood and His perfect life. His life lived for us to fulfill the law of God that we couldn't fulfill, to fulfill the covenant requirements of God's law that we didn't fulfill, that we aren't fulfilling. He did that for us in His perfect active obedience, but He also suffered the penalty of our sin. He suffered for the fact that we failed, that I failed to uphold the law of God, that I failed to fulfill the covenant, God's covenant with man in creation. So He lived for us, He obeyed for us, and He died for us. He suffered for us and took our place. So this is what Genesis sets up for us, sets up some of these covenant themes, some of these just theological themes, redemptive themes, application themes. We'll tease out some of these in the lessons to come. For now, this has been the book of Genesis. Again, just kind of a flyover, just kind of a quick flyby of some of the major themes that you're going to find in the book of Genesis. We'll come back. The next lesson will be on Exodus, and we'll go from there. Again, I guess thanks for listening. I appreciate it. Hope this is encouraging. Hope this is somewhat enlightening for you and somewhat helpful for you. So thank you very much. Lesson 2, Exodus. Welcome back to Foundations. This is week 2 of our Old Testament survey, where we're just going to walk through the whole Old Testament little by little. Sometimes we'll do one book. Like today, we'll just do the book of Exodus. Some weeks we'll do a little bit more than that. So anyways, welcome back. This is Exodus, so we'll be diving into that today. Should be some good stuff. So I want to start with this quote from a scholar named Michael Grisanti in Intro to the Old Testament book, just called The World and the Word. The World and the Word. So he says, Exodus is a book of redemption, demonstrating how the Israelite gained their freedom from Egypt by means of divine intervention. It's a book of revelation, a book in which God's character and his covenantal expectations arrive with stark clarity. And Exodus is a book of communion, delineating the means by which a sinful people could have fellowship with a holy God. Again, that's from Michael Grisanti from The World and the Word. That's helpful. I think that helps us to really hone in on 3 kind of major themes of the book of Exodus. He called them there redemption, revelation, and communion. I think that's helpful. So we say redemption, how God saves. This is a picture of how God saves. And then theology or revelation, basically what God is. What kind of a God are we dealing with here? And then holiness. What does it look like for us to live as God's redeemed people? It's so interesting. I think I'll talk a little bit more about this in a little bit, but it's interesting in the book of Exodus how first you see God delivers people from slavery, and then comes his call to holiness. So first God saves, first God justifies, first God rescues, and then he says, okay, now that you're with me, now that you've been saved, here's how you live. Here's what it looks like to walk in a holy way. So anyways, we'll get into that. I appreciate that as kind of a framing for this book. It really is. Again, this is the second book of the Old Testament, so this is kind of really still helping to lay that foundation that Genesis started so well in the first book. So again, this is just really helping us to see what does it look like. What does it look like for God to redeem? Who is God? What do we learn about God here? And then what does it look like for us to live as God's redeemed people? So before jumping into the book, I want to give a quick comment just on the idea of typology. So within kind of Bible interpretation, this is an idea that's going to be helpful just to kind of be aware of, to kind of have as a category. So basically, typology is just the idea that previous events are what's called types of later kind of more important events. So previous events in the scriptures are little pictures, they're little parables, they're little metaphors. They're real historical events, they're things that really happened, and yet these events foreshadow later more substantial, more significant, more categorical events. So really that plays out. Typology works because of 2 fundamental assumptions, or I don't know, maybe one assumption with 2 sides. So it's basically that assumption is that God is the author of both the scriptures. God is the author of the Bible, but also history. So it's not saying, there's this literary event that's just this kind of literary construction that foreshadows this other literary event. That'd just be, foreshadowing. That'd just be an author coming up with a fun story and kind of foreshadowing it earlier. That's great. That's not what we're talking about. Typology is where you have actual history, where God is to history what an author is to a book, right? So these events, specifically talking about the Exodus, what God does in Exodus in saving a people from Egypt, there are certain echoes there or foreshadowings of these historic events of later salvific events that the Old Testament itself picks up on. That even later on we get to the exile in Babylon, the return from Babylon, and all of that is kind of playing on kind of a greater fulfillment of this Exodus, a greater kind of second go at this Exodus. And obviously or I guess not obviously, but and then the fullest, most complete fulfillment of this Exodus imagery is the cross of Jesus Christ. Right, so there are, especially the book of Matthew, the work of Jesus is kind of put forward as the work of a new Moses, and then the death and resurrection of Jesus is held up basically as kind of an echo, a fulfillment of what the Exodus was pointing to all along, even as it stands as its own redemptively significant event. And so, just kind of by way of comment, that idea of typology should help us understand what some of the New Testament authors are doing. Especially, I think Matthew does probably most of this, where he will quote a historical event from the Old Testament and say, thus when Jesus did such and such, that fulfills this previous event, where that previous event isn't always even like a prophetic prediction, right? So we think of, such and such fulfilled this previous thing. We think that there's some kind of a prediction laden in that thing where you expect some kind of, in the Old Testament, you'd expect someone to be saying, hey, one day this is what's going to happen. But oftentimes it's just historical facts that Matthew will say Jesus fulfills. So there he's using it in kind of a typological concept where Jesus is fulfilling, not in the sense of kind of bringing to pass a predicted event, but in the sense of being the fuller and more exalted and more significant version of a previous event, of a previous historical event. So that's typology. Exodus. We don't see a ton of typology in Exodus, but a lot of typology later on in the scriptures points back to the Exodus. This kind of sets up a lot of typology later on. And even things like the priesthood, the tabernacle that gets spelled out in Exodus is typological, is typologically foreshadowing, is typologically pointing towards Christ. And again, you're not going to see that until you see Christ, right? So in a lot of sense, Jesus, the work of Jesus, the accomplishments of Jesus, the person of Jesus, when he comes, helps us to understand the scriptures, what was there the whole time. So it's kind of it's like foreshadowing. It's like a big twist in a story where it kind of makes sense of the previous story, even though you never would have guessed it kind of your first time through. So Hebrews uses language related to this. Hebrews 10 verse 1 says, "For since the law has but a shadow of the good things to come instead of the true form of these realities, it can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered every year, make perfect those who draw near." It kind of goes on a little bit again. So Hebrews 10:1 says, "For since the law has but a shadow of the good things to come," right? So there, the author of Hebrews is saying the law, which we get part of it, a good chunk of it in Exodus, the law is a shadow that points forward to the substance, the real thing, the real deal that's going to come later on. Romans 5:14 actually uses the word type. Romans 5:14, Paul says, "Yet death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over those whose sinning was not like the transgression of Adam, who was a type of the one who was to come." Who was a type of the one who was to come. Meaning that Adam, as this this covenant head of mankind, is a type, a shadow, a kind of lesser version of the greater one, of Jesus Christ, who would come and be the federal head, the covenant head of his redeemed people. So Jesus is on the grand scale, on the bigger and better version of what Adam always was. So again, this isn't like retrospectively kind of stuffing something into the text. This is something that is originally intended by the divine author. We're just not going to see it until the story is complete. We're just not going to see it until we see Jesus Christ. So a few examples of kind of how this plays out. You can kind of see some echoes around kind of the empty and void from creation. All of a sudden that gets, there's this kind of emptiness, this death, this darkness that gets filled with creation. And then you see something similar with the flood, but then there's the ark, right? There's death and destruction and chaos, but then there's ark. There's life and salvation through and over and against destruction. Then you see it in Exodus here, where there's judgment, but then that judgment on Egypt leads to life for the Israelites, right? So you're starting to see this kind of this echo of this darkness and emptiness and death and chaos, but that gives way suddenly to creation and life and light. There's the waters of flood and judgment, that gives way suddenly to the survival of Noah in the ark. There's the judgment on Egypt, the 10 plagues on Egypt, but then the Israelites are drawn out. That gets played out in the exile and return later in the Old Testament. Again, the high point is the cross and resurrection, the death of Christ and the resurrection of Christ. But even that plays out in our own lives, right? And this death to sin, this judgment on our sin that actually leads not to destruction, but to life, to resurrection and life in Him. So you kind of start to see some of these echoes throughout the rest of the scriptures, and even just kind of on into the Christian's life. Alrighty, so yeah, typology, it's helpful to be aware of, helpful just to kind of have that category in the back of your minds as you're thinking about what the scriptures are doing. As we'll see throughout the rest of the Old Testament is very self-referential. It is very self-aware, and so a lot of what you're going to need to understand what's happening later in the Old Testament is to see these intentional pointers back to previous events, these intentional pointers back to other events, kind of as a typological fulfillment of previous reality. So hopefully that is somewhat clear. Hopefully that can be helpful for you later on as you're reading through the Old Testament or just listening to some of these lessons. Anyways, let's jump into structure. Again, kind of what I want to cover in this book is just structure, theology, redemption, and application. Structure, kind of what's the shape of the book. Theology, what does it teach us about God? Redemption, what do we see about the gospel, about Christ, about the plan of salvation here, and kind of our role in that. And then last is, what does this mean for us today? How do I apply some of these ideas in my own life, even at a high level? So that's where we're going to go. So let's jump into structure. Really, there are kind of two basic structures that you could think about for the book of Exodus. With a lot of these books, the structure, it's not something that you really need to get too worked up about trying to exactly nail down what's where does one section end and one section begin. But it often can be helpful. It often can be helpful to kind of just think through what's the shape of this book? How does knowing kind of which part I'm in help me understand what's going on here? It just can be helpful to have some categories like that. So they're two kind of proposals for how we should think about the structure of the book of Exodus. There's kind of a geographic structure, kind of where the story is taking place is one possibility, and then there's more of a thematic structure, kind of what's the substance of the narrative, what's the point of the current section. So the geographic structure. Basically, there's the first section takes place mostly in Egypt, even with a little bit of an excursion to the desert with Moses, but it takes place in Egypt. So the beginning of the book, chapter 1, verse 1, through chapter 13, verse 16, basically takes place in Egypt, basically up to and including the plagues, right as the Israelites get sent out. Then the second section is basically the journey from Egypt to Mount Sinai. This would include the Red Sea crossing from Egypt to Mount Sinai, where they get the covenant, the Ten Commandments, the law. That would be from chapter 13, verse 17 through chapter 18, verse 27. That's kind of that section, second geographic section. And then the last geographical section is chapters 19 through 40 that all basically take place at and around Mount Sinai. So that's geographic Egypt to Sinai, and then Sinai. That's kind of how you could structure that. Then there's the thematic structure, and I think this is a little bit more helpful just because it kind of covers more of the topics, but it's a little bit more subjective as well. So you kind of take it or leave it, I suppose, however you slice the pie. So redemption. The first section of the thematic framework is redemption. Chapters 1 through 18, really where you see God just pulling His people out of Egypt and bringing them to Himself on Mount Sinai. So that's chapters 1 through 18. Then you see the next 6 chapters, chapters 19 through 24. You could call the section on covenant, where God basically outlines the covenant that He's making with His people, the kind of the giving of the law. This is where you're going to see the Ten Commandments being given. And then the third section here is basically you can call holiness or communion, to use Grisanti's words from earlier. So this is kind of the section on asking the question: what does it look like for the Israelites to live in covenant with this holy God? So this is chapters 25 through 40, and here kind of the big theme is the tabernacle, what it looks like to build the tabernacle and live rightly according to God's covenant, with his presence in the tabernacle. So that's the structure, kind of two different ways you can slice that. But I think that's kind of just helpful to see something of an overview of the basic story and basic themes of the book of Exodus. I want to give just a little bit more of a kind of detailed breakdown, just to kind of trace out the major events. So basically, chapter 1 opens with an introduction into Israel's bad situation. This is kind of detailing the hardness of the slavery of Israel in Egypt and kind of their prayer to God for help. And then chapters 2 through 4, it really covers Moses, who he is, where he comes from, his story, his kind of drama of trying to lead the people out, trying to seeing himself as a deliverer, and then trying to deliver the people, and the people reject him. The people didn't want anything to do with him, so he flees into the desert. He's there for a long time until God says, "Hey, go back." Some kind of paraphrase there, but he says, "Go back to Egypt and tell Pharaoh to let my people go." So that's what he does. Chapters 2 through 4. Then chapters 5 through 12 really is God versus Pharaoh. It's really this duel of who is the supreme God? Is it God or is it Pharaoh? This is where you see the 10 plagues and kind of all the drama of that. Then 13 through 15 is basically the story of Egypt, or of Israel getting out of Egypt, leaving Egypt, fleeing Egypt after Pharaoh finally lets them go. And this is where you get the story of them crossing through the Red Sea. Then 16 through 18 is the journey from the sea to Mount Sinai. And then 19 through 24, that's basically God spelling out his covenant with Israel, his law covenant with Israel. This is where in chapter 20, this is where you get the 10 Commandments for the first time. So the 10 Commandments come up. They're spelled out twice in the Bible, spelled out twice in even just the books, the first 5 books of the Bible. One is here in Exodus 20. Then the second time is in Deuteronomy verse 5, or chapter 5, sorry, Deuteronomy chapter 5. So those are just helpful to be aware of. I encourage you just to kind of file that away, to be aware of where could I at least go to find the 10 Commandments. Exodus 20, Deuteronomy 5. Good to keep in mind. So then 25 through 40 is the instructions for the tabernacle. Again, this is kind of that section on holiness. What does it look like to live in a holy way before God? And this is really interesting because there's kind of an interesting structure here. In a sermon not too long ago, I talked a little bit about what a chiasm is. Used that word. Basically, a chiasm is just a fancy word. So chi is the Greek letter X, right? So chi, it's a Greek letter. It looks like an X, right? And so a chiasm basically just saying that it's a block of text, a block of narrative, could be poetry, could be whatever, that's kind of X shaped, if you will. So basically it kind of moves out, starts out and then moves to a central kind of climactic moment, and then kind of recedes back out the other way. You can kind of think of it, just picture an X in your mind. That's what I'm trying to communicate. Starts big on one side and then moves into a central focal point and then moves back out in a mirroring kind of way. So often it's kind of communicated with, there's an A element, there's a B element, there's a C element, and then there's the X, there's the central focus. And then on the way back out, then there's kind of C prime that, coordinates with C, and out one more, there's B prime that coordinates with B, then there's A prime that coordinates with A. Sometimes it's reversing, sometimes it's complementing, but it kind of just has this mirrored function to kind of really emphasize the middle element to kind of communicate whatever else it needs to be communicated. It's just kind of that's a common Hebrew structure, Hebrew kind of narrative structure, literary structure. You see it all over in the Psalms, even with the structure of the Psalms, how the chapters of the book of Psalms relate to each other, to how individual Psalms function. It's all over. So this section is arguably a chiasm from 25 to 40, arguably has that kind of X structure. So basically, 25 through 30, the first kind of 5 chapters really focus on tabernacle instructions. What the tent is, the tabernacle is just the tent of meeting for God to meet with his people. So that's what that word means. So tabernacle instructions, how to build this tent, really detailing out what the ark is going to be like, the table, the lamp, the tent, all these things. Here's what that's supposed to look like. So that's 25 through 30. And then the book ends with 37 through 40 with kind of circling back to those same instructions for the, or not instructions, that details how the tabernacle was constructed, right? So 25 through 30, here's how you need to build the tabernacle, very detailed instructions. And 37 through 40 is here's how they built the tabernacle, very detailed account of how they built it, right? So those are kind of the outer mirror image on this chiasm. Then chapter 31 is about this guy named Bezalel. He's kind of the like chief craftsman for the tabernacle, about this guy named Bezalel, and then some instructions for the Sabbath. That's chapter 31. And then chapters 35 and 36, kind of, moving in from that previous section, is all about Sabbath regulations, and then describing how Bezalel gets to work, right? So you see, if this is kind of B, right, there's B, there's the tabernacle, and then there's Bezalel, and then there's Sabbath, right? And on the other end, there's Sabbath, and then there's Bezalel, and then there's the tabernacle, right? So you kind of see this mirror construction there, in this broader section. So then that begs the question: what's the focal point? What's the middle piece? So in between all of that, in the middle of all that, where what all of that is kind of pointing to, because really that's what that literary construction is trying to do, is just say, hey, look at this thing in the middle. This is the important part that explains kind of all of these things on the wing. The important part, the X, is chapters 32 through 34, which is this event where Moses goes up to receive the Ten Commandments, and while he's up there, what happens? The nation of Israel basically says, hey, Moses has been gone for a while. I think he was up there for 40 days, something like that. Moses has been gone for a while. And so we don't know if he's coming back. Let's, take up an offering, get all the gold together, make ourselves an idol, and we'll worship that God. We'll just cut out the middleman. So they do that, right? They take a collection, a bunch of gold, they throw a bunch of gold into the fire, they melt it down, they make a big cow, and they worship it, right? And so Israel, while they're waiting for instructions from the God who delivered them out of slavery to Egypt, falls into idolatry. And so God sends Moses back down to go, do something about it. And so Moses comes down, he's, really upset, and then comes back up the mountain. And what he does is he intercedes. Basically, God says, "All right, I'm going to destroy them and start over with you, Moses, because of their idolatry." And Moses intercedes, and he asks God to be merciful. And then he asks God to show him his glory, for God to show Moses his glory. And so it's a really interesting picture of God demonstrate, kind of reminding us all of our tendency towards sin, our tendency towards idolatry. Even while we're waiting on the Lord, even while we're waiting on instructions from God, it's so easy to drift into idolatry. And yet, and then God shows us his severity, his holiness and his wrath towards our sin. And yet, what's the ultimate outcome? God's mercy. God's mercy. We shouldn't read this like God was really upset and Moses kind of convinced him to cool off. Like this was God's intention the whole time, for to teach Moses even something about God's own nature, how his covenant purposes for mercy relate to his justice. So, and in the middle of it, the Lord gives this kind of self-description. The Lord, this is really famous, a really important passage from Exodus chapter 34, verses 6 and 7. Exodus 34, verses 6 and 7. Hugely important text. Encourage you to, if not memorize it, at least be familiar with it and kind of know where to find it. So this is where the Lord says to Moses, or I guess so it says here, the Lord passed before him, Moses, and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children and the children's children to the third and fourth generation. So, really interesting passage. One thing just to be aware of, again, like I mentioned, the Old Testament is very self-aware, very self-referential, in not in a weird way. And this verse is one of probably the most quoted verse. I don't know that for a fact, but very much competitive for the most quoted verse from the Old Testament in the Old Testament. The Minor Prophets gets quoted. This gets quoted several times. Jonah quotes this when he's talking, complaining to God about him delivering Nineveh. So this is a verse that gets referenced over and over and over and over again in the Old Testament. Whenever you hear someone talking about the steadfast love and faithfulness of God, that's a reference to this passage. It's a reminder of, in the face of our proclivity to sin and idolatry, on the heels of your great salvation, God, I'm appealing to your steadfast love and your faithfulness to save me, to redeem me. I'm casting my soul on your mercy, in the face of my deserving of your judgment. So, tremendously important passage. Tremendously, the Old Testament itself quotes this a ton. But so this is the centerpiece, right? So the point being that in the midst of this section on holiness, on what it looks like to live an upright and godly life in the presence of God with His tent, in the middle of it all is God's mercy. In the middle of it all is God's willingness to fulfill His justice, not with our destruction, but with something else, but that God's justice would be satisfied, even while His mercy is fully expressed. Okay, so that's kind of the structure of the book. I just love that it ends with this, the section on how do I live a holy life before God, and it gives us this chiasm that I just love. I just love how helpful this is. In the middle of answering the question, what does it look like to be God's holy people, even when God calls us to, hey, live in this way. At the center of it all, the kind of engine of all of it, is not kind of our moral effort, but God's steadfast love and faithfulness. God's steadfast love and faithfulness is the core and the heartbeat of our practical holiness. That doesn't mean we do nothing, right? Because after this, what do we see? Well, Bezalel and the other craftsmen, they get to work and they build the tabernacle. But even in that doing, even in that working for the Lord, even in that pursuing of holiness, it's centered on and it rests firmly on God's steadfast love and His faithfulness, His mercy to 1,000 generations. Okay, so that's structure. Let's jump into a little bit of the theology of the book of Exodus. So again, just what does this book teach us about the whatness of God? What is God? Who is God? What kind of nature and character does He have? A few themes. We won't really dig into any of these super deep. Could trace these out, each of these out a little bit further, but I'll just list off a few of the kind of themes that you're going to see. Again, especially, I don't want to exhaustively cover these books. A, that'd be a ton of work. But B, I don't want to exhaustively cover them because I'm not trying to give you hey, listen to this and you can skip the book, right? I'm trying to give you something that says, listen to this lesson, kind of internalize some of these ideas to help you go and read the book more profitably. I don't want you to listen to this and go, great, now I can skip Exodus. I got it. I'm just going to move on. I want you to listen to this and go, man, I should go read Exodus. That sounds really interesting. Now that I kind of understand now that I have a few handles to really hold on to it, I want to go and jump in and read it for myself. So that's my goal. So I'm not going to try to flesh all of these out to the extreme. I just want to give you a few categories to be thinking about. So one of the big things that we see in the book of Exodus, that we should see in the book of Exodus about God, is God's supremacy over the nations and their gods. God's supremacy, the Lord God's supremacy over the nations and their gods. We'll talk about God's name here in a little bit, but that's kind of one of the key components of that. I am who I am. This idea of God's self-existence, this idea of God's absolute unconditionedness is relevant to this idea. But even just the plagues, as you kind of scholars have been more and more aware of Egypt and the gods of Egypt, there's kind of a greater and greater understanding that each of these 10 plagues really was aimed at kind of rebuking and defeating one god after another from Egypt, right? So there's a Nile god for Egypt, and the first plague is that God kills the Nile. It's this dragon that God has slain, and now the Nile runs with its own blood. There's a god of magic that God kills, and then all of a sudden the magicians have no more power. There's the sun god. There's all these different the gods of the cows. All these different gods that the plagues are kind of systematically executing. Right, that God is systematically executing these gods of Egypt, saying that God is not supreme. I am. 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 Climaxing with Pharaoh himself through killing of his son, through the death of the firstborn, through the death of the son of Pharaoh. God is saying, Pharaoh, you are not supreme. Your life is in my hand. The line of the Pharaohs I will break, and I have broken, because I am God and you are not. So it's this contest, right? That's what I described that, or said that earlier. That the plagues are basically this contest between God and Pharaoh to ask the question of who is the supreme God, who is the higher God, Pharaoh or God himself. And in the end, it turns out to be pretty lopsided of a fight. So the first theme that we learn about God is that he's supreme over the nations and their gods. The second major theme is God's faithfulness to his promises. That God, when God makes a promise to do a certain thing, he's faithful to carry it out. I mean, the whole thing opens with God remembered his covenant promises to Israel, and he went and delivered these people. So God's covenant faithfulness is a major theme, that he's faithful to his promises. Third, God's holiness. It's not just God delivers his people out of Egypt and says, "Great, let's hang out. This is wonderful. Let's just kind of hang out and see what we can do." No, he delivers them and he says, "All right, now you need to be very careful how you live with me, because I am a holy God. And I'm not going to tolerate unholiness, uncleanness. Or there's got to be a carefulness about how you live before the Lord." Which should help us. Which should help us, even as Christians, to remember that the God that we're living for, the Jesus that we serve and worship, we shouldn't think of him as our buddy that we kind of hang out and shoot the breeze with. Like this is God that we're dealing with. This is the holy God. The same God who gave these commands to the Israelites is the same God that we serve, and so there should be a certain reverence and awe. This is what the whole Bible, not just the Old Testament, but the New Testament as well. This is Hebrews, what is it, 12:28? Let us serve the Lord with reverence and awe. There's a certain awe and reverence that should accompany our understanding of God's holiness. He's not someone to mess around with, even for those who've been saved. So next we see just God's sovereignty over history and kings. This is related to God's faithfulness to his plans, God's supremacy over the nations, but this is God's this is the demonstration of God's just absolute sovereignty over the outworking of history. Um, yeah, we see this all over, especially in kind of an interesting back and forth between the text talking about Pharaoh hardening his heart to the Lord, but then also the Lord hardening Pharaoh's heart. So interesting, some interesting tension there. Interesting tension there just to be aware of. But over it all, we seem to see that this is something that Pharaoh, or that God said was going to happen, that God said he was going to do long before Pharaoh even got involved. So we see God's sovereignty over history and kings. The last kind of theme I want to dig into, and really it's just kind of going a little bit deeper into some of the stuff I've already said about what this book says about God, is just kind of digging into the question of God's name. God's name. What do we do with the name of God in the book of Exodus? Again, I'm not going to be exhaustive on this by any means. But one of the big issues in Exodus comes from Exodus 3, chapter 3, verse 14, Exodus 3:14, where Moses basically says, "All right, you want me to go talk to the Israelites and talk to Pharaoh, but who should I say sent me? Who is it that I'm speaking on behalf of?" And we read in Exodus 3:14, we see there that it says, "God said to Moses, I am who I am. And he said, say to this people of Israel, I am has sent me to you. I am has sent me to you. I am who I am." So what is he communicating there? Right? What is he communicating there? There's kind of this is trite and this is absolutely not how you should read it, but you almost read the like the middle schooler kind of being too cool to give you, even describe himself, just who are you to ask me who I am? I am who I am. What are you talking about? That's not at all what's going on here. So there's this question of, but what is going on there? Why is God saying I am who I am? What is that communicating? Especially, we don't think about names the way a lot of ancient cultures, just kind of all ancient cultures, as far as I'm aware, would have thought about names. Names for most of human history, for most cultures, have had a lot more kind of weight and significance than a lot of moderns think about names. When we think about names, usually the kind of main thing we think about is, what do I think sounds nice? And that's fine. I'm not saying there's a right and a wrong. I'm just saying that there's kind of we are the kind of historical odd ones where names are mostly just kind of sounds that sound kind of nice and they kind of fit together. But when God's saying I am who I am, when God's giving his name, he's saying something more fundamental about who he is. He's giving Moses kind of a crash course in systematic theology by saying, this is who I am. So what does this mean? What does I am who I am even mean? So there's a couple takes on it. One kind of the more modern take is basically that he's basically communicating covenant realities. Basically saying that I will fulfill my promises. I am faithful. He's saying kind of like I'm unchanging in the sense of like I'm good for my word. I'm going to uphold all my promises. So it's kind of a covenantal read on it. I think kind of the more the older take, what most theologians have understood him to be saying here, has more of a kind of ontological flavor to it. So ontological, it basically just means like kind of the whatness, the being, the essence of a thing. Ontology just comes from the Greek word for being. So it's kind of the science of being. So ontological, the kind of the whatness of God, the being of God, the essence of God. Basically, that again, he's saying something similar, right? I'm unchanging, but instead of kind of having a covenantal, I'm going to keep my promises flavor to it, in this perspective, the ontological perspective, there's more of a kind of I am unconditioned, I am unchanging. My nature is denser, is more substantial than the nature of anything you've encountered. I'm ontologically different, where everything else changes and is conditioned by other things. And so that's basically the idea that where everything else is described by something prior to it, where everything else is described by some other categories and names and conditions and concepts that can describe something else. God, there's nothing behind him that can describe him. So the only way he can actually describe himself is to say, I am. I am absolute existence. I am pure existence with no limitations, no descriptors that accurately can get behind me to describe me. I am the foundation, the fundamental reality of existence. There's nothing behind me to describe me. That's kind of a little bit of just a very high level, quick overview of what kind of older theologians would read in that saying of "I am who I am." So what do we do with that? Which way should we go? Is there any other kind of categories we should be thinking about? So on the covenantal side, I think there's good arguments for it. So on the one hand, just the burning bush. I remember. So I guess context of this is Moses talking to God in the burning bush. Um, if you don't know that story, go ahead and read that in Exodus chapter 3. So this burning bush points back to the covenant made with Abraham, Genesis 15, 12 through 21, where God said, your offspring will be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and will be servants there, and they will be afflicted 400 years. But I will bring judgment, and they shall come out with great possessions. And then it says, that text says, and behold, a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch passed between the pieces. Again, you can go read that story in Genesis 15 to fill in some of the dots. But anyways, that picture of a smoking fire pot and a flaming torch, again, this kind of points forward to the covenant at Sinai. Exodus chapter 19, verse 18 says, Mount Sinai was wrapped in smoke because the Lord had descended on it in fire, right? So it's kind of this, when we're thinking about the burning bush, the fire of that bush, it should have some kind of a covenantal echo for us of God making this covenant promise to Abraham. We see greater covenant fulfillment at Mount Sinai with the fires at Mount Sinai, and so we should kind of have this covenant fulfillment idea in mind as we're reading that. So I think that's there. I think that's real. I think that's a fair category to be thinking in. But then you kind of on the pro ontological side, kind of for the ontological reading, basically just how this plays in with the contest with Pharaoh, I think is significant, where basically what we see unfold next is basically this contest of not just is God going to like uphold his word, is God faithful to his promises, but is God such a being that he can overpower the entire pantheon of Egypt? That he can kind of do battle with the entire pantheon of the Egyptian gods and come out on top. And what we end up seeing is not only is God able to do that, it's actually quite easy for him. It actually wasn't even that hard. And we shouldn't read it like a bunch of kind of almost secular moderns and kind of read it as in like, oh, well, those gods are kind of made up anyways. Like, probably most of them were. But we should have enough kind of understanding and sensitivity to the spiritual realities that the Bible shows us about the world around us, that there's not nothing going on with the pagan gods. They're not just a bunch of manipulative men kind of making things up. There's real spiritual entities involved, and so God is really overpowering some kind of real spiritual entities in the plagues of Egypt. Not to get too weird, but again, we just want to read that with a biblical worldview, not a basically modern secular worldview. So anyways, Exodus 5:2 says, Pharaoh said, who is the Lord that I should obey his voice and let Israel go? Right? The answer to that is, I am. I am who I am. God is the absolute, the unconditioned one. He is unconditioned by the whims and wills of Pharaoh, but Pharaoh is conditioned by God himself. So there's a certain ontological bent of what is God that he's going to be able to pull off this deliverance. Maybe you might see this coming, but I kind of think there's something to both of them, and I don't see them the covenantal take and the ontological take, I don't see them as being in contest. I think they're mutually complementary. I think they're kind of mutually explanatory. Again, kind of the covenantal side says God is faithful to His word. He's going to keep His word. Then the ontological side says God is powerful enough to keep His word. God is able to keep His word. Right? It doesn't really do us any good if someone is honest as the sunshine, but they're just not strong enough to keep their word. They're just not able to keep their word. They might be, have all the good intentions in the world, but if they can't do it doesn't really help us. But on the other side, if someone is powerful, if he's absolute, if he has all the power in the world, but just isn't faithful to his word, that doesn't help us either. So we need to trust God. We need to know that He is covenantally faithful, that He's going to keep His covenant, that He has the will to keep His covenant, but also that He's ontologically powerful, that He is such a being that He's able to pull it off. We don't want a God of good intentions without the power to pull it off. And we don't want a powerful God kind of with unknown and ambiguous intentions. So we need the covenantal and the ontological. And it seems like the Old Testament weds them together. A really helpful verse for you is Malachi 3, verse 6 from the Minor Prophets towards the end of at the very end of the Old Testament. Malachi 3:6 says, "For I, the Lord, do not change." There's your ontology. I, the Lord, do not change. Therefore, because of ontology, therefore you, O children of Jacob, are not consumed. Right, so there's this covenant faithfulness. So I'm good for my word because I don't change. Because I'm ontologically unchanging, I am covenantally faithful. Right, so they complement each other. They fit hand in glove, really. So kind of another wrinkle that I think is just interesting. That you might be interested in, maybe not. Is kind of the ambiguous verb tense of God's statement here in Exodus 3:14, right? Where most English translations say I am who I am, something like that. Um, the actual Hebrew, the verb tenses are a little bit more ambiguous there. So it could, without doing any violence to just the rules of grammar, it could just as easily be translated as in past tense, in present tense, or in future tense, and kind of all the combinations of therein, right? So it could be translated as I was, and I was who I was, or I am who I am, or I will be who I will be, or I was who I will be, or I will be who I am, right? Just any of those translations could work, but it's just kind of an ambiguous verb tense in the Hebrew, and so that kind of does pose the question of, well, what exactly is he trying to get at there? And I think the New Testament, the book of Revelation, might suggest that ambiguity is actually a part of the point. That we should read it as more of a comprehensive claim to just raw, unlimited existence, right? That I exist in the past, just as I exist in the present, just as I exist in the future. I'm unconditioned even by time. So John in Revelation uses all three when he records the Lord saying in Revelation 1, verse 8, I am the Alpha and the Omega, says the Lord God, who is and who was and who is to come, the Almighty. Right. So when God is introducing Himself to John, kind of interestingly, there's some parallels with that conversation with John in a cave, with God's conversation with Moses in a cave, oppressive world empires, all the rest. There's some parallels there, anyways, that you can kind of chase out on your own. But there's interesting kind of that parallel revealing of what His name is, saying this is who I am. Where to Moses He says I am who I am. To John He says I am the one who is, who was, and who is to come, the Almighty. Right. So God is kind of making this an ontological, my almightiness is being revealed here. Anyways, so that's just some interesting reflections on what Exodus teaches us about who God is. There's a lot in here. Man, this is it's just a rich book that just opens up to us. Who is this God? What is this God that we're serving, that we've been saved by, and that we're trying to live a holy life for? Super helpful. You go in there, explore it yourself, and see some more things. There's a lot of just really sweet stuff going on in there. Okay, next, let's jump into redemption. So again, we've talked about typological foreshadowing. There's a lot of that in here. So you see kind of the plagues and the Exodus, right? Kind of foreshadowing death and resurrection, foreshadowing the cross, the death of the firstborn, and resurrection, deliverance from sin and death, as well as coming world judgment and redemption for the church. All that you see typological foreshadowing in the tabernacle, in this picture of a holy life lived separate from sin, separated to the Lord. And then interesting, this is important to note. There's one of the themes that you notice in Exodus is that redemption, deliverance, comes before sanctification. Redemption comes before sanctification, right? All right, so Exodus doesn't say, all right, here's the tabernacle. What you need to do is kind of separate yourself from Egypt, build this tabernacle, start serving me, and then I'm going to accept you as my people. Right? It doesn't go, make yourself holy, separate yourself from sin, and then I'm going to redeem you. He says, I'm going to redeem you. I'm going to free you from sin. I'm going to save you from slavery. And then I'm going to teach you how to live the holy life that I want you to live, right? It's I saved you, I redeemed you, and made you my own, so that you can live a holy life for my glory. Now, here is what I want you to do to carry it out, right? So redemption, justification comes before sanctification. Again, back to even just the structure of those last few chapters. Holiness is centered on not our action, not our kind of moral power to clean ourselves up. Holiness is centered on the steadfast love and faithful mercy of God. So, yeah, redemption comes before sanctification. And then second, God saves people to himself, not just from sin, right? So we see this picture of in the start of the book of Exodus, God saves his people out of Egypt. He pulls his people out of Egypt, but doesn't just kind of leave them there. It's not just, all right, now kind of don't do that anymore. Don't get stuck in slavery again. He actually draws his people out and then brings them into his presence. Right, so it's not say God saving you. It isn't just a negative thing. It's not just, all right, now don't sin anymore. It's now live for and with me. God saves people not just from sin, but to and for himself. We see this, of course, with God, pulling them out of Egypt through the Red Sea, and then brings them to His presence at the Mount Sinai, and then says, "How I'm going to dwell with you is this tabernacle." So it all moves. So it's not just out of slavery, but it's actually towards the tabernacle. It's kind of the whole flow of the book, and that's the same for us. It's not just freedom from sin, but it's being brought into the church to dwell with God and to live with God. And then last, what we learn about redemption is that salvation comes on God's initiative. Therefore, pray for redemption. Therefore, pray for salvation. So again, this book it plays a lot, not plays, but it teases a lot, kind of the tension of God's sovereignty and human responsibility, God's sovereignty and human agency. We see that with Pharaoh as well. Kind of talked about that a little bit. But we see it even here, just in the opening kind of verses of the book. We see it in the why of God coming to redeem His people out of Egypt in the first place. This is really interesting. So on the one hand, right? Remember Genesis 15. God says, "I'm going to, your people are your descendants are going to go into Egypt for 400 years, and then I'm going to save them, and they come out. They're even going to come out with great possessions, right?" So on the one hand, we see God saying, "I'm going to do this thing." God is saving these people because He predestined that He would do so, that He foreordained that He would do so. He even said exactly how long they're going to be in slavery. But then when you actually turn to the book of Exodus, you get this really interesting take that with just these verses, you can make the argument that God saves basically because of the people's initiative, because they decided to pray to Him that He would come and save them. Exodus 2:23 through 25 says, "During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered His covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew." Right, so there's a sense where God came to save His people from slavery to the Egyptians because they prayed for it, because they groaned to Him and asked for His help. So you see both sides at play. Why did the people pray? Well, in part because it's a fulfillment of what God said they would do. Right, God predestined, God foreordained that He would save His people at exactly this time. But then in the course of history, He saved them because they called out to Him. Because they called out to Him, and we see that on an individual scale. Right, God saves any given individual because He predestined that He would do so before the foundations of the earth. And yet He saves them because they fall on their knees and they ask for mercy and they plead with Him to save Him, themselves on the basis of the righteousness and the shed blood of Jesus Christ, right? So there's why did God save, such and such an individual? Why did God save me? Why did God save you? Well, on the one hand, because God foreordained that He would do so before the foundations of the world, because your name has been written in the book of life from before the foundation of the world. But on the other hand, because you called out to Him, because you repented of your sin and believed, because you cried out to God for mercy through Jesus Christ. So there's a both and that God's absolute sovereignty is not conditioned by our free agency, and yet our free agency exists within with integrity within God's overriding and overarching sovereignty. So there's no tension there. There's no conflict there. There's not the more of my agency means less of God's sovereignty, or the more of God's sovereignty means less of my agency. The Bible just says, hey, both are true. Both are true. God saves because he foreordained that he would do so, because you prayed. How does that fit together? There's a lot of tension there. My strong recommendation is that it would lead you to worship, not to try to solve, not to be frustrated, not to think that you're smarter than other people or better than other people because you kind of figure out how the puzzle pieces fit together. The result is that you should worship. That when God delivers you, you should say, "Thank you, Lord, that you have saved me." Okay. I'm gonna go ahead and just wrap it up with a few just quick comments on kind of practical application. How should this impact our life? How should the book of Exodus kind of shape and impact our lives, our walk with the Lord? First would just be that through Exodus you should consider Jesus Christ. That Exodus should point you to be thinking more about Jesus Christ. As the one who was judged, that you might be saved, that the one who suffered darkness, like in the plague, so that you might see light, that he's the firstborn who died, so that you might be set free. He's the lamb that was slain, whose blood was, smeared on the doorpost, like from Exodus 12 or wherever that was, maybe 11, maybe 12. He's the lamb who was slain, whose blood was smeared on the doorpost, whose blood frees you from death. Right? He's the sacrificial lamb who gives you access to God. He's the true tabernacle where God dwells with his people. He's the high priest who represents you before God and is God to you, who reconciles you to God. So the Exodus should point you to Jesus Christ. It's just full of typology pointing you to Jesus Christ. Second, again, salvation comes on God's initiative. So pray for salvation. Even the same for those who are saved, for those who are justified, for those who are Christians, pray for sanctification. Pray that God would further sanctify you, would further help you to walk in holiness. Third, strive for holiness, right? Strive for holiness, and not as a way of earning salvation, not as a way of kind of working towards freedom, but strive for holiness out of assurance of salvation, out of assurance that you have been delivered from slavery to sin and death and darkness. You should walk. One of the things that Exodus should teach us is that the fear of the Lord is a good thing, but it should be the fear of sonship, not the fear of servitude. The fear of a dutiful son who honors and loves and respects his father, not the fear of a slave that fears his master. So the Old Testament as a whole is going to hold up for us the fear of the Lord as a good Christian virtue that we should be living in and even cultivating in ourselves and those around us. So Exodus tells us that fear is again, it's the fear of those who have been adopted, not the fear of those who've been taken into captivity. Different, very different kinds of fear. Next, pursue holiness to walk in fellowship with God, right? So there's this picture of the tabernacle that we're not saved from our sin just to kind of do whatever we want and ignore God, but we're saved to live in a certain holy life with and towards and for God himself. Then last, you're saved to be a light. Exodus helps us see that you're saved not just for your own sake, but to be a light to those around you. Exodus 19, verses 5 and 6 says, "Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel." So God saves us as individuals, but he draws us together as a church so that through us, through the gathered church, he can save others. So the Exodus is not kind of just about God and Israel. The Exodus is about God saving the world from sin and death, in part through Israel, in part through the testimony of this nation. So in the same way God saved you, he drew you out of death and hell to make you, believer, a priest, a minister of reconciliation. God saving you is not just about God saving you, but about God saving your family, saving your friends, your coworkers, your neighbors. God is drawing you into his presence, into his covenant people to make you a light to the nations. God's work in you is not just meant to stop with you, but meant to expand to those around you. So that's kind of some practical thoughts to reflect on from the book of Exodus. There's tons more. It's a good book. It's a thick book. So again, encourage you to go dig into it on your own. Encourage you to go just check it out for yourself. Hopefully this can be helpful for you, just as, again, just a little bit of a guide to kind of give you some handle to hold on to as you jump into it. Anyways, thank you for listening. Thank you for taking the time to hear this lesson, and I hope this is encouraging, helpful, and enlightening for you. Lesson 3: Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. All right, welcome back to Foundations. My name is Dean VanEvery, the associate pastor here at Grand Avenue Baptist Church. So this is lesson 3 of our Old Testament survey series. It's kind of going to be walking through the entire Old Testament, book by book. We'll touch on each book, but not every lesson will have its own book. In the end, it will be 21 lessons. So obviously we'll be doing some squishing things together. This is one of them. We're going to be covering Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy today. I'd originally thought about doing kind of Genesis and then the rest of the Pentateuch, but then Exodus needed its own lesson, so we broke that out and did that by itself. Each of these, man, these are full of really good stuff. But they work in a way that I think that there's a helpful way to look at them together, not as one unit, but kind of as complementary to each other. And so I think just with trying to have economy of time and not letting this whole process run on into too many weeks, we're going to go ahead and kind of squish these together into one lesson. Hopefully we'll be able to tease out some of the high level ideas. That should open up some doors to talk about just how these 3 books relate to each other and kind of the shape of the Pentateuch as a whole. Pentateuch, that's just Greek for, I think, like five book or something like that. It just means the first 5 books of the Bible. So it's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus here, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. That's the first 5, sometimes called the Book of Moses, often referred to just as the Torah. Which is the Hebrew word more or less for law, often used as words, sometimes interchangeable with the whole of the scriptures as a whole. But anyway, so we're going to be tackling Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy today. Again, so this is basically the books of Moses addressed to the Exodus generation and then the desert generation. So this is the people who they themselves and their kids just got brought out of Egypt through the plagues, through the Red Sea, all those things we talked about in the last one. So this is the generation of the people that God has called out of Egypt, and he's called them to Mount Sinai, where he gave them the law, and then he's taken them to the promised land. So this the Pentateuch goes from creation in Genesis to Exodus, and then from Exodus out of Egypt, right up to the very edge of the Promised Land, right up to the very edge of Canaan, of Israel, where the story in Deuteronomy ends with basically they're just poised to cross the Jordan River and enter into the Promised Land. And so basically what's happening in these 3 books, in Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, you can kind of think of it basically like God preparing this people to enter the Promised Land. So Exodus, he takes them out of Egypt, and then this basically covers the space of about 40 years. The narrative of these three books. The Lord is taking, one generation, ushering them off the stage, and then the next generation preparing them to enter the Promised Land. And so each of these books plays a different role in that. So specifically Leviticus and Numbers. Leviticus is almost entirely, I'm trying to remember if there's any narrative at all. Almost entirely Moses laying out laws, Moses laying out different divine regulations for different aspects of life. And then Numbers is mostly narrative. Numbers covers narrative. Basically, I'll get into the structure more, but covers 2 generations, kind of the generation that got brought out of Egypt, and then the next generation, their children. And it kind of tells those 2 stories in 2 different narrative arcs. And so basically, well, the way you can think of it is that Leviticus is kind of the formal kind of law code preparation to be the people of God. This is God saying, hey, here's the structure of what it's going to look like for you to be the people of God, for you to serve me, to live with me, to be my people. And this is what it's going to look like kind of in a form sense. And then in Numbers, you see a lot kind of more of the emphasis on the substance, a lot more of the faith of the Israelites, a lot more of the fear of the Lord, a lot more of the obedience of the Israelites, where there's these narratives playing out where you see one generation being unfaithful, not having the fear of the Lord, having the fear of man instead, and not being obedient to the Lord, and that generation gets, like I said, ushered off the stage, and the next generation, not perfect, not without their flaws, but an evident leap forward in the fear of the Lord, an evident leap forward in faith, an evident leap forward in obedience. And so, Numbers, you kind of see the Lord preparing his people kind of in substance, right? In kind of the subjective side of shaping in them, faith, fear of the Lord, obedience, all those things. And then Leviticus is the formal structure of that. You can think of it like in Numbers, God is heating up the raw material. He's smelting the iron. And then in Leviticus, he's pouring it into the mold. He's pouring this substance into the form, right? So there's the reality, the substance that we see kind of in the narrative of Numbers, and then kind of the formal structure gets spelled out more or less in Leviticus. Deuteronomy kind of comes in basically as a capstone to the entire Pentateuch. It's Deuteronomy is just from the Greek meaning second law, or law a second time. Basically because it covers a lot of similar ground as Exodus and Leviticus. If you remember from Exodus, there's a lot of law code in Exodus, and so Deuteronomy kind of recapitulates a lot of that, restates a lot of that. Again, you get the 10 Commandments. Again, Exodus 20, you get the 10 Commandments. Deuteronomy 5, you get the 10 Commandments. So it's kind of the law a second time. There's also some narrative, also some important narrative. You also see some subjective stuff that's really important, some kind of substance of the faith stuff that's really important. This is where you see the greatest commandment. I'll touch on this in a minute. Where the Lord Jesus Christ points back to and says the greatest commandment is that you would love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. And this comes right out of Deuteronomy 6. And then you see this, what's interesting in Deuteronomy is you see this kind of tracing of that theme of loving the Lord with all your heart. Deuteronomy 6, it's just love the Lord with all your heart. Then Deuteronomy 10, there's this interesting kind of rebuke from the Lord saying, all right, guys, you're not obeying me because your heart is not right. So what you need to do, here's what you need to do. You need to fix your heart. You need to circumcise your heart so that you can obey me, so that you can love me. Not surprisingly, they don't. They can't. They can't change their own hearts. Their heart is the seat of their will, the seat of their affection, the seat of their volition. They can't change that in and of themselves. And so you get to chapter 30, verse 6, which is one of my all-time favorite verses. Is a sweet promise of what the Lord is going to do for his people kind of after. It's this really interesting arc where he basically prophesies that the people are going to be faithful for a while. There's going to be great prosperity for a while, but then they're going to kind of decay into apostasy. They're going to be judged. They're going to be sent into exile. And then they're going to eventually, the Lord is going to call them back out of exile. And then in that day, what the Lord is going to do is he's going to circumcise their hearts and the heart of their offspring so that they will love the Lord their God with all their heart, with all their souls, that they may live. Right, so there's this promise of one day, after this great and terrible judgment in Babylon, after you return to the land, then I am going to change your heart. I am going to give you the substance, the true substance, so that you can obey. We see this coming in and through the ministry of the Lord Jesus Christ. That's one of the big transitions from the old covenant into the new covenant. Under the old covenant, the substance of all the promises is the same, but it's just these unchanged hearts of the vast majority of the people. Some people really are changed. Some people really are born again. Old Testament saints that were saved in the Old Testament were saved in the same means, under the same processes. They had the dwelling of the Holy Spirit in them. Faith comes from God. It's a gift from the Holy Spirit. So it's not a carnal faith. It's a spiritual faith that these Old Testament believers had. So it's not that they weren't there. It's just they were a stark minority. They were a stark minority. The vast majority of God's covenant people were unbelieving, were unregenerate. And the great change with the new covenant is that now the vast majority are. That the vast majority of the covenant people are regenerate, are born again, have been given the new heart through the working of the Spirit of Christ. So that's kind of the high level overview of kind of what's happening in these three books, leading up into this, getting into the precipice of the Promised Land. All right, Leviticus kind of prepares them formally. Here's the structure. Numbers prepares them kind of subjectively, personally. Here's the substance. And then Deuteronomy kind of packages it all together and kind of puts a nice little bow on it, and ends with the death of Moses, Joshua taking over, and basically, all right, we're ready to go. Let's go ahead and cross this land. Rolls into Joshua, the next book, and you see that that story unfolds. So really, I just want to make a quick comment. The issues that are addressed, especially in these three books, really are applicable to kind of the American church in our context right now, right? So culturally, our culture at large, American culture at large, for a long time has been basically all form and no substance, right? So it's all kind of all law, all these cultural norms, these cultural expectations, explicit law, implicit law, but it's kind of we kind of hollowed out any substance. Where basically we live in this kind of not just materialistic, but kind of this postmodern truth relativism where there just is no possibility of substance. It's just all naked form, or I guess substanceless form. And a lot of our societal upheaval is basically people are recognizing that's just hollow. You can't build a life in that. You can't build a family in that. You can't have a culture built on nothing that's just kind of wearing masks and costumes. So we're in this kind of empty formalism as a culture broadly. That's kind of the natural generational outflow of kind of a hedonistic, nothing really matters, so do whatever you want, kind of a couple of generations ago, rolls into a now we're saying, well, that's empty too. Well, why would I waste my time doing that? I'm actually gonna try to I want to build something substantial. I want to tear down this empty facade and I try to replace it with something that has some actual substance to it. So you have this kind of upheaval in kind of the American cultural mindset, just of we don't want empty form anymore. We don't want this hollow, empty mask of a culture. We want something with actual substance. And then at the same time, for the last couple of generations, the American church has kind of been all substance and no form. It's been all kind of the inner subjective side and no form structure, no strict structure, no structure of kind of actually seeing what God tells us to do for our kind of lived out lives. One kind of parable of this is kind of what happened with the kind of so-called with the gospel-centered movement, where kind of there was this idea of let's have a retrieval, basically a retrieval of the gospel. Of let's kind of move away from legalism. Let's move away from a strict list of rules of how you can dress and how you can act and what kind of movies you can watch and what kind of stuff you can do. So it started. This gospel-centered movement started as this much-needed corrective to some genuine legalism, to some genuine legalistic tendencies in the American church. Kind of over time, as kind of the first generation of leaders either passed, either died or moved on, or even just kind of grew over time. This movement broadened out and kind of diversified and kind of lost its central, I don't know, central core tenets. Became kind of devolved into kind of an antinomian, just refusal to apply God's law to any area of life in concrete terms. Right, so what started as a retrieval of the gospel somehow drifted into a losing of God's law, just kind of letting go of God's law being meaningful in any kind of concrete way. So the kind of the result of that is that we have the substance of the gospel, but having kind of no uniquely Christian form. Individual Christians and Christian culture as a whole just kind of just gets molded by the secular Americanism form around us. It just we're heated up and melted down into this gospel substance, but then the only form available for us is this kind of secular humanistic Americanism. And so that's what you see, where the church still talks a good game about the gospel, but it just kind of can't have an answer to this just pull of a secularizing form of being shaped into the image of secular America. So one one clear example of this, it's one of those things that just like it just smacks you in the face once you start kind of looking at the dates of some of these things. But one kind of clear example is basically the growing tendency to basically hyper spiritualize, strip away the form of the Sabbath. That basically kind of spiritualizing it into it doesn't really matter. Just kind of go to church and you're fine. That just so happens to kind of coincide with the rise in popularity of the NFL, of the National Football League. And so you have this substance of wanting to honor the Lord, wanting to honor the substance of the Sabbath command, yet without any actual biblical form, without any biblical pattern to pour that into. The only form we have is kind of just secular American, what do you do on Sunday afternoons? And so the NFL makes a lot of money. Anyways, yeah, that's just one example. So another kind of more, I don't know, more penetrating example is kind of what happened in the end of the teens, 2016 through 2019, all kind of that era when this like kind of social justice fever just kind of took over American culture broadly. The American church really didn't have strong footing in biblical principles of justice. So we kind of
kind of just rolled along with these secular forms of justice, these secular creeds of what justice is supposed to look like. And so we kind of traded biblical principles of justice for what these secular humanist theories of justice were giving us. And we ended up with a lot of injustice, with a lot of partiality, because we didn't have a biblical form to fill with the substance of gospel living. So what we need, right, was very similar to what this Israelite generation of the Exodus generation needed, is both form, Leviticus, and substance, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Right, we need both we need to recover and to rebuild this Christian understanding of what it means to actually practically live under Christ's lordship. And that by definition has to go just way beyond what we do on Sunday mornings between 9 a.m. and 11:30 a.m. It has to go way beyond what we do in our small groups, what we do in our Bible studies. So one area that's just kind of screamingly obvious for this is the area of education. It is the area of educating children. So education, just in what it is, just kind of is the impartation of both form and substance. It's the mature in a culture talking to the immature in a culture and saying, this is the substance and this is the form. That's just the definition of what education is, passing on the culture into the next generation. So this is why when a secular humanistic society like ours puts on government schooling, they're not religiously neutral. There's just no such thing. There's no such thing as being kind of worldview, religion neutral. They're training students because of what they are, because of the worldview they hold. They're training students, and not every individual, but just as a system, training students and cultivating their students to live lives committed to secular humanism. That's just baked into what school is. A Catholic school tends to put out Catholic students. A Muslim school tends to put out Muslim students. A secular humanistic school is going to enculturate students into a secular humanistic worldview. That's just how education works. If you aren't answering the big questions about what we are, what is true of the world, how we ought to live, then you're just not educating. You're just not actually doing the task of educating in the first place. But if you do answer those questions, then you answer them out of your worldview. You have nothing else with which to answer them. And that's not a fault. That's not an accusation. That's just doing their job. That's just an inevitable fact of what it means to educate the next generation. And this is why, and this is relevant to Deuteronomy. This is why for Deuteronomy, again, the capstone of the Pentateuch puts such a key emphasis on education of the next generation. Deuteronomy chapter 6, this is where Jesus finds what he calls the greatest commandment, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength. What's the context of that? What does he go on? What does Moses go on to elaborate? What does the Lord go on to elaborate through that? Basically, this commandment is the preface. It's kind of the grounding statement to God's instructions to the Israelites for how they are to educate their children, for how they're to pass along both the form and the substance of what it means to be God's covenant people. So substance and form are both needed. And one of the kind of key elements of form that we just need to recover in our day is education, is what it looks like for God's people to educate the next generation of God's people. So this is kind of the main thrust of these three books, basically establishing gospel form and gospel substance for the covenant people. And we should take some lessons from this, right? Being saved by grace through faith doesn't make God's law irrelevant to us. It makes it a delight to us. It doesn't make it irrelevant. It makes it a delight. So as Christians in the modern world, the great task of this generation is recovering and rebuilding gospel form, recovering the great historic Protestant consensus on law and gospel, and learning to apply both the gospel and God's law to every area of life in the modern world. That's not an easy task. That's not a small mountain to climb. This is a hard task for a hard age that calls for hard men to respond with faith and with joy, to gladly do hard things. Ours is not the age to retreat. Ours is not the age to shrink back, to kind of retreat into kind of academic fiddling with ideas and concepts. Ours is the age to take up the call and the standard of King Jesus to build lives and families and churches for him, for his glory, and for the good of our world around us. Charles Spurgeon, just legendary 19th century Baptist British preacher, ends one of his sermons kind of touching on the idea, basically kind of lamenting the kind of lack of bold and energetic and joyful and faithful leaders in his generation for the cause of Christ, who are making an impact on the world. Kind of lamenting the lack of that kind of men. He ends his sermon with a line that I think is just it's applicable for our age. So he says there, "Here is the day for the man, but where is the man for the day? Here is the day for the man, but where is the man for the day?" Okay, that being said, before getting into the books themselves, I'm looking at about 20 minutes, I suppose. So I think this shouldn't be too long on actual kind of details in the book. So I'll try to do a little bit more of a high level analysis on these. But I think it's important to lay out some of these principles before tackling it. It'll help you kind of understand what's going on in these books. Again, my goal isn't to exhaustively cover these books so that you kind of don't need to go read them, but kind of to set you up to want to go read them. My hope is that after you read this, you would go, wow, I have some handles and I'm really interested and I want to go read Leviticus. I want to go read Numbers, not, oh, great, now I can skip it. No, that's not the point. So I'll be a little bit higher level on the actual details on these ones. So that being said, kind of with that picture in view of, we need to recover a good concept of law and gospel. And before, we jump into these books, which are so heavy on law and gospel, I want to lay out for you just some, a good principle or a good pattern for what it looks like to understand how the Christian should think about Old Covenant law, how the Christian should think about Old Testament law for us today, the laws of Exodus, the laws of Leviticus and Deuteronomy. How should Christians think about those? So this is a highly contested question. I'm not going to say this is a simple question or that these ample answers are simple and just kind of neat and tidy. We can be done with it. Lots of really, really respectable theologians and perspectives that you can take on this. New Covenant theology is a newer school. Progressive covenantalism is a newer take, and there's a lot to commend those perspectives. There's dispensationalism as well is another answer to that question. But I think they all have all of those kind of more modern perspectives. I just have pretty serious flaws and tend to be very, very like hard to actually do anything with. Very hard to actually go from here's this law to how do I apply that. It tends to, from what I've seen, my perspective, it seems like a lot of those answers to the question of the law for the Christian tends to more or less amount to kind of explaining away what God says in the Old Testament. And that's not as a rule true. It just seems to kind of complicate things so much that it basically leaves you empty-handed at the end of the day. So I think the best approach, I think it's by far the most helpful and clear approach, but also the most biblical. I really do think this is the most faithful to the actual biblical text. Especially of what the New Testament says about the Old Testament. I think it is the classic Reformed confessions. I think the classic Reformed confession, especially of the English-speaking 17th century, or English-speaking confessions of the 17th century, I really do think that those just have the clearest and the best articulation of how the Christian and even Christian societies should be thinking about the law of God. So I want to read a few paragraphs from the 1689 Second London Baptist Confession of Faith. So this is kind of the kind of foundational confession of faith from Reformed Baptists, from Calvinistic Baptists, out of London, obviously. Southern Baptists hugely influenced by this, especially historically. Many of our the Baptist Faith and Message 2000 kind of is an evolution of a confession of a confession of a confession of a confession that eventually works its way back to this confession. So it's a very rooted Baptist historic confession. It's really, really good, really beautiful. Lots of it, and a lot of what it does is it kind of takes the Westminster Confession, takes the Savoy Declaration, kind of the congregational modification on the Westminster, and basically it says, man, that's great. That's really, really good. So we're gonna take a lot of it, mostly to say, hey, we're on the same page on these things. But then we're gonna modify it where we think it falls short. Obviously, baptism itself being a key issue, but not the only issue. There's lots of stuff lots of or a good handful of tweaks that I think are helpful. But anyways, London Baptist Confession, 1689. It's good stuff. All right, so chapter 19 on the law of God, starting in paragraph 2. I want to read a little bit for you. So paragraph 1 basically just says that God wrote his law on Adam's heart, so that Adam kind of knew it intuitively and kind of was instructed by God with his law, just kind of intuitively from his creation. Paul in Romans 2 will say that basically that's still there. That's still functionally there. It's been marred. It's been corrupted by the fall, by human tradition, all those things. But that's still kind of in principle true. So it's the laws written on Adam's heart. Paragraph 2 then jumps in and says, the same law that was first written in the heart of man continued to be a perfect rule of righteousness after the fall, and was delivered by God upon Mount Sinai in the 10 Commandments, and written in 2 tables. The 4 first containing our duty towards God, and the other 6 our duty to man. So 2 tables meaning like two tablets. And on the first tablet was the first 4 commandments containing our duty towards God, and the other tablet, the other rock, contained the other 6, that was our duty to man. Again, Jesus sums this up as love the Lord your God with all your heart, love your neighbor as yourself. That's a summary of the 2 tables of the law of the 10 Commandments. And again, it's not, they're not here saying that the 10 Commandments just are that law, but that law is expressed in the 10 Commandments. So again, just specifying that universal law written on Adam's heart was given to all people through Moses on Mount Sinai. So then he's into paragraph 3. This is helpful. He says, besides this law, remember the 10 Commandments, besides this law, commonly called moral. So note that. I think that's just important to note. You're going to see here in a little bit here 3 divisions of the law: moral, ceremonial, and civil. Or I think the confession here calls it judicial, kind of legal, right? The judicial law. Anyways, moral, ceremonial, and judicial. Moral, ceremonial, and civil, right? So the moral law here just is the 10 Commandments, right? That's it, right? That's the substance of the moral law. Then everything else in the Old Testament, everything else is either civil or ceremonial, or some mixture of the 2, right? Everything else is civil or ceremonial. The moral law is just the 10 Commandments. That's really important. For some reason, critics of the Reform perspective just don't see that for some reason. So a lot of critiques of the Reformed position on the law for the Christian, it just is attacking a straw man. And I think they just don't know, because I think a lot of it happens to be like it's just this older position that it's easy to just kind of take the critiques that you've heard somebody else who's on your side, take his critiques, assume that they're all correct, and repeat them. And I think there's a lot of that where people just aren't actually going back and reading the sources, reading the confessions, and seeing what the Reformed actually say about the threefold division of the law. Anyways, that might not ever be a debate you find yourself in, but it's interesting to know, I think. Anyways, it might be helpful. So then he goes on, or I guess, yeah. So besides this law, commonly called moral, God was pleased to give to the people of Israel ceremonial laws containing several typical ordinances, partly of worship, prefiguring Christ, his graces, actions, sufferings, and benefits, and partly holding forth diverse instructions of moral duties. All of which ceremonial laws, being appointed only to the time of Reformation, are, by Jesus Christ, the true Messiah and only lawgiver, who was furnished with power from the Father for that end, abrogated and taken away. That is quite the sentence. That is a run-on. I think that was all one sentence. Wow. Okay, so basically the point being, these ceremonial laws, they point us, what they do is they point us to Jesus, and they kind of flesh out some of our moral duties, or they kind of their commentary on what it means to not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, what it means to not worship idols, what it means to honor the Sabbath, or kind of flesh out those details a little bit. And so the point of that, whether they're the laws pointing to Jesus or specifying our moral duties in the first table, Jesus abrogated them. The ceremonial law is abrogated in and through Jesus Christ. So then you get to paragraph 4. So you have the moral law, the ceremonial law. Then paragraph 4 says, to them also he gave various judicial laws, which expired together with the state of that people, Israel, not obliging any now by virtue of that institution, their general equity only being of moral use. Right, so here's the third category: judicial laws, some often called civil laws. So when Israel ceased to be a nation, these laws ceased to be relevant to the believer, ceased to be relevant kind of in their specific details to the believer. But yet, take careful note of that last clause where it says their general equity only being of moral use. Right? So what does that mean? Basically, what they're saying there is that these laws, as kind of the specific statutory code, are no longer specifically binding on Christians or Christian societies, and yet they still teach us truth about God's moral law. They still teach us truth about good and godly legislation for God's covenant people, for a society of people trying to live for and with the Lord. Meaning, so what the Levitical and the Deuteronomic laws calls evil is still evil, right? But we're free to kind of structure our specific laws differently. Right, or to put it another way, right, we don't need to copy and paste these laws into the American legal code, and yet legislators should be consulting these laws as a sketch of what God calls evil and what God calls just, right? So the general equity basically means like kind of the point of these laws is still good legislation. So something like there's laws in there about who is responsible and who needs to pay what based on, if your ox gores somebody, stabs somebody, is that the first time he's gored? Well, then there's one penalty. You didn't see that coming, but you are still responsible to pay for his medical bills, whatever. But if it's, if it's like the second time that bull has gored somebody, like if that's a goring bull, that bull likes to stab, then that's actually a bigger penalty, and now you're on the hook for manslaughter, right? It's much bigger, right? And so kind of that idea of like, okay, there's a certain measure of what it means to not take life unjustly applies to, what do I do with my bull? And even for those of us that don't have bulls, it still raises the question of, well, what do I do with my, construction equipment, right? What do I do with my heavy machinery? What do I do with my vehicles, right? So there's the general equity, that principle of like, hey, what your bull does is your responsibility, and you need to be thoughtful about how that's impacting other people. The kind of the spirit of that law is still valid, that legislators should be thinking about. That's kind of the thrust of it. That's the classic reform position, the classic, probably even just the Protestant position. Luther says pretty similar things in some of his works. So, anyways, so that's just kind of jumping into these laws. So what you need to be thinking is not like, there's a bunch of weird laws that aren't relevant to me at all. But neither should you be thinking, oh man, I need to be doing all of these things. These are specific things that I need to be doing. No, the Christian perspective is something somewhat in the middle. The general equity of these laws is still meaningful to you. Basically these laws still teach you something, even though the specific code is no longer binding, being abrogated through Christ. Okay, that's quite the intro. So let's go ahead and jump into Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Yeah, look at my notes. I do plan to be fairly high level on this, so it shouldn't end up being too crazy long. But who knows? I've been known to go a little bit longer than I imagine sometimes. Okay. Structure of Leviticus. So I'll go through. I'll still go in the same order. So I'll do structure of Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Then I'll do redemption of Leviticus, Numbers. Or I guess theology of Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Redemption, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Application. Right. Just that was kind of how that worked out in my notes. So I'll just kind of do it that way. Anyway. So Leviticus. A good kind of tagline for Leviticus would be from chapter 19, verse 2. You shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy. Leviticus is basically a manual, or a set of manuals on what it looks like for Israel as the covenant people of God to be a holy nation. So first, basically it's broken up into several different kind of manuals for various aspects of living with God. Chapters 1 through 7, you could call. I'm getting a lot of this again from Grisanti. I think it's Michael Grisanti from the World and the Word. He was really helpful for a lot of these Pentateuch books. And then some other books as well in here. But so he breaks out these divisions this way. So chapters 1 through 7 is the Leviticus. You see a manual of sacrifice, right? Basically, what it means to enjoy God's presence. And so again, as these ceremonial laws point towards Christ, this manual of sacrifice for the Christian should really first and foremost be reminding us of the sacrifice of Christ for our perpetual living before the Lord. So chapters 1 through 7, manual of sacrifice. Chapters 8 through 10 is a manual of the priesthood, what it looks like to enter God's service, the clothing for the priests, how to be ordained as a priest, all those things. Then manual of purity, kind of what it looks like to just do life as one of God's creatures. This is 11 through 15. Looks at ceremonies and practices for holiness concerning daily food, concerning childbirth, concerning diseases, and just kind of bodily processes. And so there's just this picture of what it looked like to live a holy life with regard to these just mundane human activities. Then you get the manual of atonement. So this is kind of the big sacrifice, the big once a year sacrifice of forgiveness. That's chapter 16. You see the Day of Atonement. spelled out there. Then a manual for holiness, basically enacting God's word, is chapters 17 through 26. So kind of, again, just kind of daily life, worship calendar, kind of national festivals get spelled out. This is where you get what I quoted earlier, you shall be holy for I, the Lord your God, I'm holy. But then also chapter 19, verse 18, where we see you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I'm the Lord, right? So we see just these roots of New Testament principles being sown or being digging down in the Old Testament itself. Then last, we see the manual of dedication in chapter 27, basically what it looks like just to dedicate this nation, this tabernacle, into or to the Lord. So that's Leviticus. Just a series of basically manuals for kind of different areas of life. And that's that form that I was talking about. This is giving form and structure to what it looks like to live out the substance of gospel life. Again, the details aren't binding on us, but the principles still are. The principles are there to teach us about what it looks like to be one of God's creatures, especially among God's covenant people. So then Numbers, structure of Numbers is a little bit more simple. Basically, there's two big sections and kind of a little intermediate, kind of a seam section in the middle. The first section is chapter 1 through 21, basically the old generation, the big kind of arc of Numbers. There's one generation that is unfaithful to the Lord, that gets judged and that dies in the desert. And then there's a second generation that rises up that is faithful, that believes, that obeys, that is faithful, and then it prepares to enter into the promised land. So chapters 1 through 2, the reason it's called Numbers is you see two big censuses, two big countings of the people. The first one is chapters 1 and 2 is the first sentence. 3 through 10 is basically the people preparing to go to Sinai to take the journey to the mountain. 11 through 19, you see basically a kind of a steady slide into rebellion. And this is where you see the big rebellion here is chapter 14, where the people refuse to enter the promised land, right? They get up to the edge of Jordan and they send in some spies to go check out the land. And they come back and they basically say, the land is beautiful. It's wonderful. But there's some pretty powerful nations there. I'm pretty sure they even have giants. Like this doesn't look great. Wonderful land. Going to be some hard fighting. I don't know if we can do it. And the people basically say, yeah, we probably can't. We're not even going to try. Let's just go back. Like God probably brought us here just to kill us. So let's not do that. They don't trust the Lord, right? They just saw God crush the mightiest empire in the world without even their intervention, and now they're afraid to go and engage these nations in battle. And so this lack of faith is kind of the key moment of their judgment. Is the key moment of their lack of faith, their lack of obedience, leading to their judgment. And the Lord promises that all of them, that generation, everyone, I think it was 20 years and older, other than like the two faithful spies, Joshua and Caleb. God says that they will not enter the promised land, but they're going to die in the desert, and their children will enter in the promised land instead of them. So it's an unfaithful generation, and this section ends with the death of Miriam and Aaron, who are leaders in Israel, and Moses' sister and brother, respectively. And there's some high points and some low points. It's not kind of a monolithic dark. It's like the backside isn't monolithic light. There's some highs and lows in both of them, but the trend is down in the first section and up in the second section. So then you get this middle point, this middle section in the middle, chapters 22 and 24, where you see this weird interaction between Balaam and Balak. Balaam is basically a prophet for hire. It's interesting because he's not a like prophet of the Lord. He's not a God-fearing prophet. He seems to be basically like a witch doctor, something like that, something to that effect. Kind of a soothsayer, an astrologer or whatever, who hires out his services to give prophecies to the highest bidder and all that. And so Balak is the king of the Moabites, pretty sure. So Balak is the king of the local nation. And basically Balak tries to hire Balaam to curse Israel. He just says, all right, Balaam, I just want you to call down a curse on this nation so that we can defeat them in battle. And Balaam basically says, like, you know what, I'm gonna do what you asked me to do, but I can only do give you the words that the Lord puts into my mouth. And so he kind of like, it's weird. He kind of like goes to try to curse Israel, but I think it's 3 or 4 times. All he can do is bless them. All he can do is just give these prophecies about the glorious future of the world that God is going to work through Israel. And interestingly, even, rising to the point of predicting this star, this king who's going to rise out of Israel. He has this line, or something to the effect of like, he was near, but not yet. He's close, but not here. It's just this really sweet prophecy of the coming of Christ, the coming of the one who's going to rule the nations to the blessing, to the glory of God and the good of all peoples. What's so interesting here, what I think is important, is where this sits is right after just the wild unfaithfulness of the older generation. Have just been completely unfaithful to the Lord, did not trust him, did not obey him, did not believe in him, feared man more than they feared God. And yet God's covenant promises are still true. God's covenant promises are still absolutely certain. So this should just be a helpful reminder for us. Again, especially in a season like ours, where we're kind of looking around or wondering, what are the forms of gospel structure that we need to rebuild over the next couple of generations? What is that going to look like? How can we possibly have a thriving future in this nation or any other nation? How can God's purposes still possibly work in and through our generation and the coming generations? This little section reminds us that that's just totally the wrong thing to be looking at. We shouldn't be looking at the news. We shouldn't be looking at, Barna reports. We shouldn't be looking at Pew reports and going, oh, here's what's the future of the church holds. No, that's ridiculous. The future of the church is told to us in the Bible. The future of the church is told to us that the government shall be on his shoulders, Isaiah 6? No, 9, Isaiah 9. The government shall be on his shoulders, says Christ the Lord. The government shall be on his shoulders, and of the increase of his government and of peace there shall be no end. The kingdom of heaven is like leaven that fills, that works its way into the whole lump, that through the line of Abraham, all the families of the earth will be blessed, that Christ has authority over all nations. And so we are making disciples of all nations. That Christ is not going to be defeated by world philosophies and world power. So we don't look at the news. We don't look at the faithfulness or unfaithfulness of our generation and wonder, how is God possibly going to do something through us? No, God is still working his promises. God is still going to be faithful to do the things he promised to do. Our hope for the success of God's kingdom in the world should not be based on what we observe around us, but what Jesus Christ has told us. He is building his church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. He is building his church. So Numbers then ends with that last section, 25 through 36. This is the new generation, that second generation. There's another census, and basically you see the numbers. They're very close to each other. The great masses that were brought out of Egypt have been replaced by this new generation. And you see Joshua gets appointed to replace Moses. He gets kind of the tap on the shoulder of coming leadership, and then kind of the nation in 28 through 36 basically just gets prepared and set up to enter the land, to cross the river and enter the land, which sets us up with Deuteronomy. The book of Deuteronomy, again, this is basically, you think of it almost as like a series of sermons from Moses, structured intentionally, fit together very intentionally. So chapters 1 through 4 is basically kind of a historical review of how God has redeemed the promises he made and how he has redeemed his people. Chapters 5 through 26, that's kind of the bulk of it, is basically the covenant and law. It's kind of, again, a recapitulation of God's covenant with his people, how they're going to live with him and for him and under him and through him in the promised land. And then 27 and 28, it's a really striking section, basically just curses for disobedience and blessings for obedience. Curses for, if you don't live according to my law, here's all the bad things that are going to happen. If you do live according to my law, here's the blessings I'm going to pour out on you. So these are fascinating and just a helpful picture of what God has in mind for these people. Ultimately, this leads into chapters 29 and 30, which is basically warning and promises and prophecies of, all right, one day, kind of like I said earlier, there's going to be a long stretch of faithfulness, and you're going to be blessed. And we see that unfold under David. But then there's going to be a slow decline into apostasy. And in that day, you're going to be taken away. You're going to eventually be judged and sent into exile. But then when I hear the cry of my people, I'm going to save them. Again, I'm going to bring them out of exile, bring them back into the land. And that's where you get and once I bring you back into the land, then I'm going to circumcise your heart. I'm going to actually change your heart and write the law on your heart. Which again is kind of one of the earlier kind of new covenant, new heart promises that we start to see throughout the scriptures. That theme, again, back to our kind of fugue, adding layer after layer after layer, this is kind of where you start to see that I'm going to give you a new heart theme start to get developed. It gets greatly expanded in the prophets, especially in Ezekiel, and then into the minor prophets a little bit as well. This promise of a new heart. And then Jesus picks up on in John 3. You must be born again if you're going to see the kingdom. It's not just look at Jesus, kind of make some rational decisions and obey him. There's actually a spiritual regeneration that's required to see and recognize and love and know Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. Jesus picks us up again, John 6, where he says, no one can come to me. No one's going to come to me. No one's going to believe me. No one's going to follow me. No one's going to receive me as Lord and Savior. No one comes to me unless the Father who sent me draws him. So unless the Father does a work in your heart first, you're never going to see and believe in Jesus Christ. So that's 29 and 30. Then 31 through 34 is kind of the narrative epilogue. You see Moses' song, which is it's great, but it's kind of mostly judgment. It tends towards judgment on the coming unfaithfulness of the people, which even just kind of sets up this kind of pessimistic tone for fallen man without renewed hearts. Just aren't going to, over the long run, actually keep God's law, actually keep the law that God has given them. So Moses, chapter 33, Moses' blessing for the tribes, and then chapter 34, Moses dies, and Joshua takes the lead of the nation. So that's the basic structure of these three books. Theology, I'll be brief here. So theology of Leviticus basically is just that God is holy, and we need to be cleansed from our sin in every category to live with him. Numbers, the big theology point is that God will fulfill his purposes in the world, but we are still held accountable and responsible for our actions. God's promises don't exclude us from his discipline, right? God's promises, God's covenant promises aren't excuses for laziness, aren't excuses for presumption. We're still called to live and obey in faith. Okay, then Deuteronomy, basically, what I would kind of add to that is just this idea that righteousness is a matter of the heart. It's not just about kind of doing the letter of the law, but actually being renewed from the heart to gladly obey God and his covenant requirements. So in redemption, Leviticus basically the idea is that dwelling with a holy God will require blood atonement for sin. We see this in the sacrificial system. We see this especially in the Day of Atonement, and what it takes to ordain the priesthood and all the sacrifices that are required. We just see this all over the place in Leviticus that living with God requires blood cleansing from our sin. All these animals point to it, but it's not actually accomplished until Jesus Christ himself comes and bleeds on the cross for us. So redemption, again, Numbers, basically in spite of our faithlessness and failures, God will fulfill his promises because he does not change. Numbers 23:19 is right in that big kind of hinge section, just says, God is not man that he should lie, or son of man that he should change his mind. Has he said and will he not do it? Or has he spoken and will he not fulfill it, right? So the big thrust of Numbers is just that. God is faithful because he does not change. In spite of our faithlessness, even as we are disciplined or even punished for our faithlessness, for our disobedience, for our backsliding, even as we're disciplined, God does not change, and God is still faithful to his promises. And then ultimately, he's going to raise up a king from Israel, which is in Numbers 24:17, that God is going to raise up a king through whom he's going to bring about this global blessing. So redemption, again, Deuteronomy. Basically, we see here, it's one note to note here, another kind of one of those layers that starts to get brought to the surface in Deuteronomy is just his anticipation of a prophet like Moses. A prophet who is like Moses, who will bring about a new covenant. So this comes out in Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 15 through 19, where Moses says, in that day, there's going to be a prophet like me who's going to come from among you. When he comes, listen to him. When he comes, listen to him. God's going to put his words in his mouth, so you listen to him. We see this, I think we see this fulfilled in the Transfiguration. We see this Matthew 17:1-5 is where you can see this, where Jesus and Moses and even Elijah are on this mountain, and a couple of the disciples are there witnessing it. And all three of those men are there, Jesus, Elijah, and Moses. And a cloud of glory descends on them, and a voice from the cloud says, "This, Jesus, is my beloved son. Listen to him." Basically saying, this is the one that Moses was talking about. He has come now, so now listen to him. His word now supersedes Moses. His covenant now supersedes Moses. Okay, so that's kind of the redemptive themes in these three books. Last, just a quick note on application. So there's a big idea, really, in all of these, but a big idea in Leviticus is just the call to trust in Christ as both our priest and our sacrifice. He is both the priest, kind of the one who affects the agent who brings us to reconciliation with God, but he's also the sacrifice itself. So Leviticus should just cause us to reflect on just the incredible grace and sacrifice that is the work of Christ on the cross for us. The Numbers, basically, this is a call to pursue holiness and to pursue obedience. Even saying that sin has generational consequences. The sin of that older generation led to their children spending the first 20 years, or I guess 40 years of their life wandering around in the desert. not a great inheritance to pass on to the children. So pursue holiness, pursue obedience. Again, not to earn God's salvation. They've already been brought out of Egypt, but out of, because of what God has done, because of the salvation that God has done for you in Jesus Christ. Pursue holiness, pursue obedience, pursue the form because you've been given the substance. And Deuteronomy, one of the common themes, especially in chapters 30, after it lays out the covenant, lays out the blessings and curses, then Deuteronomy 30 hits this theme of I've given you two paths. There's a path of life, there's a path of death. Choose the path of life. The Psalms pick up on this theme pretty heavily, just saying that these two ways. There's the wise man that meditates on the law, and there's the fools that meditate on wickedness. Choose the path of life. Right? So that's kind of the aspect of Deuteronomy, that there's a law, there's a way that God has laid out for you to live your life. So choose the path of life. You have been bought from death into life by the blood of Christ, purchased for you, given to you on the cross, confirmed in the resurrection, given power in the Holy Spirit through the resurrection, so that you can walk the path of life. You, Christian, your heart has been circumcised. You have been changed, that you can love the Lord your God with all your heart. So choose the path of life. Okay, that is all I have to say about these three books. Yeah, these are tremendously important books. I think taken as a whole, I think they do work well together. So I think it's helpful to consider them together. Again, I hope you would just take these as handles, as rails to go and jump into these books. Man, these books are rich. They are long, and there is a lot of detail. I just give one encouragement for reading through them. I would encourage you to read them in bigger chunks. I wouldn't recommend reading kind of one chapter at a time. I think a lot of these three books, especially, they have big story arcs and they have big blocks of text that I would recommend, if you can find the time, if you can do it, read it in 5 to 10 chapters at a time. I think that's going to actually help you read it kind of at the cruising altitude. That's going to be the most helpful to actually understand what's going on and actually gain something from it. Something like Book of Proverbs, you should read 3 or 4 verses at a time. Right, you should read that slowly and kind of chew on each of it. Book of Romans, you probably could do maybe half a chapter, maybe a chapter. Right, that's a good kind of pace to just chew on the details, what's going on there. Numbers, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, man, you got to read these at a high level. You got to read 5, 10 chapters at a time to see the big arc of the story of what's going on. So that's one encouragement I would give you, is instead of trying to read, one chapter a day over a month to get through them, try to set aside, pick a Saturday, take an hour and read 10 chapters, 2 or 3 times to get through them. That might be the most helpful way for you to actually engage these texts kind of as they are. Anyways, okay, that is all I have to say about these 3 books. Hopefully this is helpful. Hopefully this has been interesting to you. I hope this just helps you again to just long for a day, even in our day, when God would raise up good and godly form, that we would grow as a church broadly, that we would grow as people who appreciate, understand just the biblical relationship of law and gospel, that God's gospel doesn't save us from the law, but actually saves us so that we might delight in the law. It would be freed from the penalty of the law, freed from the consequences of sin and death from the law. Absolutely. Yes and amen. But we're freed to actually live lives delighting to obey God in and through his law. Okay. I hope you would find much wisdom in reading these books. The Lord would open your eyes to cherish his word, love his word, and walk according to his word. May God bless you.
Lesson 4, Joshua and Judges. Okay, let's go ahead and jump back into it. Welcome back to Foundations. Welcome back to Beyond Foundations. My name is Dean VanEvery, the associate pastor here at Grand Avenue Baptist Church. So this is our the last of the kind of re-recorded lessons for Foundations that I've been circling back through and doing. If you remember, I kind of explained in I think it was the Genesis lesson. Originally, these lessons weren't recorded. These lessons, I just kind of did them live, and that was it. We started recording them in the next one, which I believe was Samuel, the first and second Samuel, should be. So these I've been re-recording these, working back through the earlier lessons, and so a couple of there's pros and cons to that as I've been working through this. The pro, I think, is just I've been able to kind of bring some more. A little bit more reflection on the rest of the Old Testament back into some of these earlier lessons, which I think has added just a little bit more kind of cohesion and some depth to them, which I think is helpful. But kind of on the negative side, there was I was just coming in hot out of being researching these things much more deeply back when I was doing them live. So I've been thumbing back through my notes and looking back through some things and rereading some things. But basically I'm just working from my notes that I had almost a year ago by now. So anyways, take it or leave it, take it for what it is. These are just kind of, this is, again, it's the last of the re-recorded. So this next one, if you're working your way through them in order, the next one you're going to get to is the original live recording. So you have that to look forward to, I suppose. Anyway, so this is Joshua and Judges. We're going to cover Joshua and Judges. This is the first books after the Pentateuch. So the Pentateuch is just Greek for 5 books. So the Pentateuch is the 5 books of Moses, and then Joshua takes over from Moses as the leader of the nation of Israel at the very end of Deuteronomy. And so then Joshua picks up with Joshua, kind of tells his story, how the Lord uses Joshua to lead the people into the land of Israel, the land of Canaan. So quick, just overview of what we're doing here. So the Old Testament, the purpose of the Old Testament is the same as the purpose of the New Testament. These aren't two kind of unrelated bodies of literature. What the Old Testament is doing, the New Testament is fulfilling. So the Old Testament is bringing you to the New Testament. The Old Testament is setting up and giving the foundation and groundwork of the New Testament. So what is the whole Bible about, and what is the Old Testament about? The Old Testament is about God reconciling all things to himself through the cross of Jesus Christ. The Old Testament is about God reconciling all things to himself through the cross of Jesus Christ. In chapter 3 of the book of Genesis, we see sin enter the world through Adam and Eve's disobedience. We see the serpent deceiving Eve, who then brings Adam into it. And so we see sin enter the world there in chapter 3 of the whole book. And so there we see global curse, where God in judgment, as consequence of sin, curses the whole world through our disobedience, through the disobedience of the human race. And so then what the rest of the Bible is about is God, through his son Jesus Christ, undoing and replacing global curse with global blessing. We see global curse, and then we see in the rest of Genesis global blessing promised. So this gets picked up right away in Genesis, and so there we kind of see basically this kind of threefold or 3-part promise that God gives. First, really clearly to Abraham. It gets hinted at even at the beginning. It's hinted at to Adam, and so there's so even with Adam and Eve, even with the line from Adam to Abraham, there's faith in God, faith in God's Messiah. But it's really clear with Abraham, where God he promises basically this threefold promise. He promises he's going to make Abraham great. He's going to make him a great nation. That's part 1. And then part 2, that Abraham and his people, his nation, is going to flourish in the land. Especially through their obedience to the Lord, they're going to flourish in the land that God gives them. And then 3, through that nation, God is going to bring about global blessing. God is going to undo global curse with global blessing. So there's this promise of being a great nation. There's promise of possessing and flourishing in the land of Canaan, the land of Israel. And then 3, this promise to be a blessing to the whole world. And so really the story of the Old Testament kind of works that out, how has that blessing and that blessed and covenant people, how has their reception of those promises played out? How has God been working in and through their faith and their disobedience, and kind of as they've been in tension? So the rest of the Old Testament is a story. The rest of the Bible is a story of that promise working its way out to bring about that global blessing. So this is the Old Testament. This is kind of where the story that Joshua and Judges picks up in, and really Joshua and Judges is kind of the one of the major transition points, one of the major transition kind of seams in the Bible. So at the very beginning of Joshua, the people of Israel are not yet in the Promised Land. They're not yet in Israel, and so by the end of Judges, the people have been in the Promised Land for a handful of generations, and so it's kind of transitions from the exile generation into really just about on the cusp of setting up the monarchy with Saul and then David. But we'll get to that in the next couple of lessons. So just before jumping into these 2 books, I think these are difficult books. These are challenging books. I'm not necessarily so much a kind of intellectually challenging. More so, they're just heavy books. They're weighty weighty books. So these are often a lot of kind of the, is God really good if he would allow X, Y, and Z, especially, pointing to things in the Bible. Often the kind of those objections are going to find themselves pointing at one of these two books. They're going to find themselves pointing at something from Joshua, something from Judges. There's a lot of content in here that, let's just say, children's Bibles tend to skip over. Have several different versions of kind of quick story Bibles to read to my kids, and they often will mention some things from these chapters, but often kind of skips over the bulk of them, and with good reason. I think these are things that are understandable that you wouldn't want to draw in a way that you'd present to a 4-year-old. But anyways, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time really digging into and addressing kind of some of those difficulties, but I want to give a few comments just on the front end. So first off, if you're reading these books and you find something that you're going, wow, this is hard. This is hard to wrestle with. This is somewhat disturbing. First off, that's not entirely inappropriate. It's not entirely inappropriate to be feeling those things. Second, I'd encourage you to go talk to somebody, especially if you're at our church. Come and talk to one of the elders. Come talk to one of the pastors. Let's kind of talk through some of those things. A lot of those things, they're not going to have kind of neat and tidy. Oh no, you're misreading that. That's not what happened. No, there's some disturbing things that happen in these books, in these two books here. But you're not the first one to notice it. You're not the first one to be troubled by it. You're not the first one to struggle with these things. So just if you're really wrestling with some of these things, come and talk to us. Or if you're at a different church, go and talk to your pastors, and just kind of with humility, with faith, have those conversations, and just know that you're not the first to be just concerned with some things that you find in these books. Second, and there's kind of two different flavors to I'm speaking fairly generally because there's two different things going on in these two books. So for instance, in Judges, you're going to see a lot of kind of the heroes, or a lot of the main characters at the very least, doing some disturbing things, doing some wicked and some evil things, without much commentary, where the Bible doesn't specifically say, oh, hey, this was a bad thing that guy just did. There's a few things going on there. I mean, the first one is simply just literary style. In our kind of modern narrative, we often expect narratives to kind of spoon feed us who the good guys are, who the bad guys are, what's good, what's bad. So someone does something bad in a book, and you expect there to be some kind of very clear clarification of, and it was an evil thing to do, that was a wicked thing to do. But the Bible is gonna basically expect you to have read the previous books and carefully enough to recognize, oh, when this Levite is serving at an idolatrous temple, at an idol, when this Levite is serving at an idol, that's bad, right? You can see the book just kind of expects you to know that. So don't expect a ton of kind of commentary to give some color commentary on some of the really messed up things that you're going to see in these books. And so that's a part of the Bible. What's happening there basically is that you're seeing. I'm trying to kind of getting ahead of myself a little bit. Basically, what you're seeing there is that in this period of history, the people of God just weren't living faithfully, and so they were descending into more and more moral chaos. And so what's happening here is the Bible isn't holding these things up as moral exemplars, or even just kind of like, hey, this is normal, this is kind of what's happening. It's holding them up specifically to show the growing faithlessness, the growing disobedience of God's covenant people. But then on the other side, with Joshua, it's not so much people doing wicked things, so much as seeing God's judgment in very strong terms, seeing God's judgment not just on wicked people, but on wicked nations, on wicked kingdoms. And so that's just a hard reality to really chew on, especially in basically a humanistic age like ours, where kind of the default assumption is that humans are basically good. That mankind is basically good, kind of underneath it all. We're all basically good. We just kind of make some mistakes every now and then. And that's just not the picture that the Bible paints of human nature. That's not the picture the Bible paints of I should say, fallen human nature. And so we see that coming to the surface in the book of in the book of Joshua here, where God is pronouncing and calling for and requiring that Israel execute pretty stern judgment on these nations. And so that's hard to see. It's just hard for us to grapple with, to see judgment like this falling on these people. And so there's a little bit more that could be said to that, but just recognize that you're not the first one to read that and think that this is challenging. This is a stern view of God's holiness and God's judgment, that quite frankly we're just not versed in engaging with. We just don't grapple with, and quite frankly, our age is just so unserious, and it's such a small view of the fear of the Lord that even among Christians, even among those who believe in Jesus Christ, who confess their need for a Savior, there tends to be this difficulty in seeing God as this holy, and seeing sin as this severe, and seeing God's judgment as righteous. So even in that, a couple of pillars that I would point you to, that I would just encourage you to kind of hold on to, are basically these two biblical anchors that you just need to have in your mind. The first comes out of Psalm 145:17. Psalm 145:17 says, "The Lord is righteous in all his ways and kind in all his works." So everything that God does is righteous. That God has never done, has never commanded, has never willed anything unrighteous. Everything that God does is righteous. So that's obviously something that's going to that we're going to struggle with if we have a low view of human sinfulness. If we have a low view of God's holiness and the penalty of our sin, we're going to struggle with seeing God executing such stern judgment. So it's the first pillar, the first anchor we just need to hold on to is God's absolute righteousness. He has never done anything even slightly unrighteous. And the second is God's wisdom. Is God's wisdom out of Romans 11, 33 through 35. Oh, the depth of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God! How unsearchable are his judgments, and how inscrutable his ways! For who has known the mind of the Lord? Or who has been his counselor? Or who has given a gift to him that he might be repaid? So as God's righteousness, everything God has ever done is righteous. Everything God will ever do is righteous, is good, is just. But on the other side, God is wise. Every decision God's ever made, every thought God's ever had is wise and far beyond our wisdom. So when we struggle to wrestle with how is this wise, how is this right, how is this appropriate, at some point we need to just put our hand over our mouth and say, I am not as wise as God. I am not as knowledgeable as God. I am not as all-considering as God. God is righteous and God is wise. And so with that in mind, that doesn't make Joshua kind of easy to stomach. It doesn't make some of the things that we see there not hard, and yet it should give us enough humility to say, I just am not God. I just am not. I just am not a high enough pay grade to make the kind of judgments that I'm thinking about making. That this God who is doing these things is just and He is wise. And at that, we just have to rest at that. Okay, well, let's go ahead and jump into these books. First up, Joshua. I'm just going to walk through, like I've been doing, structure, and then theology and redemption and application and all the rest there. So let's jump into the structure. So Joshua, kind of the high level maybe subtitle you could give to Joshua is basically just this, or the main point is that we see God here fulfilling His promise through a faithful people. In Joshua, we see that God fulfills His promises through a faithful people. Specifically in Joshua, we see kind of the fulfillment of basically stage 2 of that threefold promise that I was talking about a few minutes ago, of a great nation, the land, and worldwide blessing. So the great nation has already been fulfilled as people multiplied in Egypt. But then here we see the fulfillment of the second stage that God gives them, gives the people the land. So Joshua can basically be broken up into more or less four sections that really can be defined by kind of a key word that each section uses. So chapters 1 through 5, the key word there is basically enter, from the Hebrew habar, which just means kind of like pass over into, enter into, more or less. So here is just repeatedly we're seeing these commands, these instructions to enter the land, and how they are preparing to enter the land. So they cross the river and they enter the land in the first 5 chapters. In chapter 3, we see basically a miraculous kind of echo of the crossing of the Red Sea, where God parts the Jordan River so that Israel can, or I guess, stops the Jordan River for a little bit and piles it up so that the people can cross the river on dry land into the land. Then the second part is chapters 6 through 11. Chapters 6 through 11, the key word there is take the land, from the Hebrew lakah, which means take. So basically, in chapters 6, 7, and 8, we kind of see a zoomed in narrative of what's happening there. To basically spell out how this conquest is going to happen, how the people of Israel are going to take the land from the Canaanite inhabitants. Chapter 6, we see the Battle of Jericho. This is a famous battle where a city has these great impressive walls, and God commands the people of Israel basically to take their instruments and march the band around the city. And at the end of it, they shout, and the walls fall. God through that faithfulness, God makes the walls to fall. Kind of the main point of all of this is basically just showing that the conquest that we're about to see is not because of Israel's great strength and great strategy, but because simply of God's power. Because of God's power exercised in and through their faithfulness. In and through their faithfulness, even when it looks hopeless. Then chapter 7 shows us kind of the inverse of that, of the failure of Israel to take the city of Ai. The failure of the Israelite people to take the city of Ai. And it turns out the reason that they failed is because one man decided to keep some spoil from the conquest of Jericho that he should not have taken. That one man in the nation was unfaithful to God's commands, and so they failed in their attack on Ai. So they punish this man, they execute him, and they remove him from the community, and then the nation is faithful and is victorious at Ai. And so again, we're seeing this emphasis of that the final cause, the final reason for the covenant people's success or failure is not strategy, it's not circumstances, it's not what's going on around them. It's, are they going to be faithful to the Lord or not? If they're faithful, God will bless them, they'll prosper. If they're unfaithful, God will curse them, they will not prosper, they will be defeated. This is kind of the lesson that we see getting laid out in these 6, 7, and 8. Then chapters 10 and 11 basically, or I guess 9, 10, 11 basically zoom out, and we see basically the rest of the land being conquered. And interestingly, they conquer it through the armies coming to attack them. So in chapter 10, we see the southern kings, they kind of rally together and they go and attack Israel, the people of Israel, and yet they are defeated because God defeats them. And then chapter 11, we see the northern kings, they get together and they come and attack Israel and are defeated as well. And so that's the section 2, the take the land section. Then chapters 12 through 21, the key word there is divide, from the Hebrew halak, divide the land. Where basically we see the land getting apportioned out, that the land is being divided to the various tribes and sub-tribes of the people. Then chapters 22 through 24, the key word there is serve, from Chabad, serve the Lord in the land. And we see basically just, some more instructions and details on what it's going to look like, what's going to be required of them to faithfully serve the Lord there in the land. Okay, so that is Joshua. Then for Judges, the structure here, basically you can think of it like the cyclical descent, kind of like a downward spiral, a cyclical descent into paganism and idolatry. A cyclical descent into paganism and idolatry. Basically what we see here is after the fulfillment of stage 1, Abraham becoming a great nation in Exodus, after the fulfillment of stage 2, God giving this nation the land of Israel in the book of Joshua. Here in Judges, we see a failure, or at least kind of the non-fulfillment of stage 3, of bringing about this worldwide blessing. And again, not because God was not powerful or God was not willing, but because the people were not faithful, because the people did not serve him with a whole heart. So again, I kind of mentioned this earlier. Is it somewhat hard to kind of catch everything that you need to catch to really get the thrust of what's happening here in this book? There are some details that the author is just kind of going to assume that you're going to know what to do with. Towns are going to be mentioned that you just kind of need expected to know what the significance of them are. Other certain details are going to pop up of someone doing something or not doing something that you should just kind of be familiar with from the Pentateuch to recognize as good or as bad. And so there's just a lot of stuff in here that it's going to require just kind of a faithful internalizing of the rest of the Old Testament to be able to kind of really understand what exactly is trying to be, what the book of Judges is trying to say to you in any given moment. I'll try to point out a few of those situations, but they're just it assumes you're just going to be very familiar with the Pentateuch as you read this book. So structure here. Really, chapter 1 and the first 5 verses of chapter 2 really just kind of set up, pick up the story where we left off, kind of setting us up where we left off, really just pointing to really the incomplete conquest of the land, really pointing to how the people of Israel did not completely fulfill the conquest as the Lord had told them to in the book of Joshua. And then in chapter 2, 6 through 11, 2, 6 through 11, basically we see kind of the trajectory of the book spelled out. We see kind of here is where this book is going to go, and really just sets it up basically by saying that after Joshua and kind of the men from his generation, the generation of leaders around Joshua, after they had all died, basically immediately what we see immediately is that the next generation just is not faithful. The next generation just is not faithful to the Lord. The people were faithful to the Lord as long as they had Joshua, as long as they had this generation of faithful leaders. But as soon as they left the scene, the next generation was not faithful. So then chapters 3 through 21, basically the rest of the book, what we're going to see is that downward spiral into paganism, that the downward spiral into paganism and idolatry. So one of the kind of major refrains that you're going to see, a common phrase repeated over and over, especially in these first 13 chapters, is the sentence, "Israel did what is evil in the eyes of the Lord." Israel did what was evil in the eyes of the Lord. You see that in chapter 2, verse 11. You see that in chapter 3, verse 7 and verse 12. You see that in chapter 4, verse 1, chapter 6, verse 1, chapter 10, verse 6, and chapter 13, verse 1. Israel did. The story repeats back to this point over and over. Israel did what is evil in the eyes of the Lord. So as you're reading this book and seeing kind of progressively weirder and darker stories happening, just understand that that's the point. You're supposed to be seeing this progressively darker nation. We see this mostly through, especially in the first kind of half of this section, maybe more than that, basically through seeing these judges who are progressively less virtuous, less godly, and more ungodly, more wicked. So chapter 3, we see basically a series of kind of uncomplicated good guys. It's just men who, this guy was the judge, this guy saved Israel. Things were great for a little while. We see Othniel, Ehud, Shamgar, not really much commentary on them, just they saved Israel. They were some good faithful guys. Under them, the people were faithful, and they rescued the land. Then chapters 4 through 16, basically we see kind of these progressively more compromised leaders, right? It's kind of you see this kind of growing inadequacy, growing ungodliness in these leaders. So first off, we see a judge named Barak, and he's okay, he's fine, he's really he's good, but he's not quite as courageous as he should be. He's not quite as brave as he should be. Then we see Gideon, and he's, I mean, quite frankly, there's a lot of stuff where it seems he's presenting him just as quite cowardly. So he's told to go destroy this idol, and he kind of waits till midnight when nobody's around. He kind of goes and does it in the dark of the night. Okay, he did the thing. That's great. I mean, he's not. He's much better than the judges that come later on, but we see this kind of cowardliness. We see he's repeatedly asking the Lord to prove himself, repeatedly asking the Lord to confirm what he's saying to him. And then it gets even worse than that. He leads, after he has delivered the people, he actually leads them to mostly faithfulness, but actually leads them into indulging in certain forms of idolatry. You see this in chapter 8, verse 27. And what's important here is this isn't a first commandment kind of idolatry. This isn't a false gods kind of idolatry, but this is a second commandment kind of idolatry. This is a worshiping the right God, but in idolatrous means, in idolatrous ways. Kind of idolatry, right? So he doesn't go and lead them to worship the gods of the nations, but he leads them to worship the true God through an idolatrous means, through an idolatrous way. And then interestingly, he sets himself up as he kind of refuses to be called the king directly, but then you see this kind of interesting detail in how he decides to name his son. So names in the Bible are much more significant than names to most of us these days. But sometimes you just kind of need to translate the name to kind of see what's going on there. So Gideon, he refuses to be called the king of Israel, to be set up as the king of Israel, but then he names his son Abimelech. He names his son Abimelech, which in Hebrew just means my father is king. My father is king, which is quite the name to give to your own son. So this is something that Gideon is kind of setting himself up as more than he is supposed to be. And then this Abimelech, the son of Gideon, is just dark. He is just wicked. So he's not a judge himself, but he's the son of a judge, and so you see some compromise starting to come up there. Then we see in chapter 10, verses 1 through 5, another couple of judges are listed without really much commentary. Tola and Jair, don't see really anything about them, so maybe they're still kind of uncomplicated good guys. We just aren't told very much. And then we see in 11 and 12 the judge named Jephthah. So he makes a foolish pagan vow with wicked consequences. And so he is someone who basically is almost indistinguishable from a pagan leader. And then we see Judges 12, 8 through 15. We see a guy's named Ibzan, Elon, Abdon. And again, there's not a lot mentioned about them, except for the fact that I think either between them or each of them had 30 sons. These guys had 30 sons. So there's not really a lot listed about those, but at the very least, you can kind of understand that these aren't exactly husband of one woman kind of guys. So we just continue to see this kind of declining virtue in some of these judges. So then we get to 13 through 16, and we see the story of Samson. Who basically is held up as strong and as fighting these battles for the Lord, but just as foolish and just with this strong lust for foreign women and foreign wives, which ultimately leads to his destruction. And in a lot of ways, some will argue, and I think that there's good reason for this, that basically Samson and his adultery or just sexual immorality is basically kind of being held up at this point in the story to kind of point to and be a mirror image to Israel's idolatry. Throughout the Old Testament, idolatry, the Lord talks about idolatry as spiritual adultery. Idolatry as this spiritual covenant unfaithfulness. And so Samson, indulging in sexual immorality, indulging in adultery, indulging in the pursuit of foreign wives, is being held up basically as an example, as a mirror to Israel, saying, this is what you're doing with foreign gods. This is what you're doing with other gods and foreign gods and all those bad things. So we see these judges who still they save Israel. They're faithful to the Lord. They fight the Lord's battles, and yet we see this kind of downward spiral into destruction. And interestingly, I think there's in some of them, I think especially in Samson, you do start to see kind of an ethic of repentance, an ethic of turning back to the Lord. One thing that I think is just really suggestive is so at the end of the story of Samson, he gets captured by the Philistines, the enemies of God. He gets taken to basically one of their parties, and he's chained up to a couple of pillars to mock him and all those things. And he prays to the Lord to give him strength to fight his enemies one more time. And it says that in that moment he bowed with all his might, and pushed over the columns and knocked over the building and took out all the bad guys. But it's just this interestingly suggestive imagery of bowing with all his might, just suggesting this like faithful repentance to the Lord that I think it's just suggestive. It's just kind of sitting there. But I think it's just this sweet, even early introduction of just this ethic of turning from foolishness to faithfulness. So, and this is where, at this stage in the book, basically up to this point, these guys, they're all still held up as heroes, as basically the good guys that delivered the people of Israel. But they're obviously compromised, and there's this kind of this downward trajectory, basically a movement where at the beginning it's the faithful men of God delivering the people of God to be faithful to God, and by the end it's kind of these just kind of confused, semi-faithful, semi-pagan, just confused guys saving a confused people to basically be confused. So it gets muddy, and that's a part of the point. So you have that recurring refrain that we saw earlier: Israel did what is evil in the eyes of the Lord. Then you get this new refrain at this point in chapter 17, where twice here and then later we see this line that everyone did what was right in his own eyes. We see that in 17 verse 6 and 21 verse 25. And we see another refrain pick up as well in 17 verse 6 as well. It says, "In those days there was no king in Israel. So it's just to get an explanation of why everyone was doing what was right in his own eyes. There, in those days, there was no king in Israel. We see that in 17 verse 6, 18 verse 1, 19 verse 1, and 21 verse 25 as well. And basically, here's where it kind of goes from like this descent into more confusion and darkness into just rampant wickedness, into just dark corruption. It's just dark from here to the end of the book. So in chapter 17, we see the story of Micah and a Levite. And it's just this weird story of this guy named Micah who basically he steals some silver from his mom, and then he turns it into an idol, and then he hires one of Moses's great grandsons to be a priest to this idol. It's just this odd story that just kind of, it doesn't really accomplish anything other than saying, hey, things are messed up. Especially the note just of this guy being Moses's great grandson. It's just such a it just shows how bad things have gotten. But just think about how many of the Ten Commandments we see being violated there. So he steals some silver, so that's eighth commandment violation, right, from his mom. So there's extra fifth commandment violation turned right there, and then turns it into an idol. So there's at the very least a second commandment violation, if not a first commandment violation as well. And so you just see in just these little stories all kinds of pointers back to how the Pentateuch is getting mangled and broken here. And then you see 19 to 21, another Levite, a different Levite. Again, just remember that it's interesting that both of these stories involve Levites. So Levites are supposed to be the priest tribe. They're supposed to be the tribe who is teaching Israel how to live and follow God's law. And yet we see here in the darkest chapters of the book of Judges, this is where the Levites come in to just be corrupt, to just be leading the people into dark directions. So there's this Levite, basically he has a concubine and he goes and he's traveling, and while he's traveling, his concubine gets killed. That's even darker than that, but his concubine gets killed. And so then basically he at this town called Gibeah, which again is the town, or not again, but this is the town where King Saul is from. So that should kind of be triggering some thoughts for you, or at least that should be, when we get to King Saul, that should trigger some thoughts back to this town. So and so this Levite basically sends messages to the rest of the nation saying, "Hey, these guys, you killed my concubine. We should come and avenge her and be avenged on this town." And so then the rest of Israel basically wages war on this town and on Benjamin, the tribe that this town is a part of. Which then leads to Benjamin getting very, diminished in number, and they're all of a sudden worried about, well, man, what do we we don't want Benjamin to be totally destroyed, so we need to find them some wives, but we have the rest of Israel, we've sworn an oath to not give them any of our daughters, and so how are we going to find daughters for these Benjamites? Well, let's go to Shiloh. Which again, it doesn't explicitly get laid out, but so Shiloh is where the tabernacle was at that point. This is where the Ark of the Covenant is. This is where this is the seat of God's name. This is kind of like Jerusalem before Jerusalem was Jerusalem. So as I said, let's go to Shiloh, and while they're having a festival to the Lord, well, we're going to kind of sneak up on them and kidnap a bunch of women and give them to the Benjaminites as wives. And so you read that and you just go, there are no good guys in that story. There is no good guy in that story. There's some victims, but there's no good guys in anywhere in that story. And you just see the unfaithfulness just rippling through this book. And that's the point. That's what you're supposed to see, is that without Joshua, without the virtuous judges, and before there were any kings in the land, remember in those days there was no king in Israel, before the king, the people were descending into wickedness, into paganism, into idolatry. Israel has become a nation of wicked pagans because they do not have a king. That's the point of what you should be seeing in Judges. So what are some just points of theology to tease out? So first, for Joshua, would you see that God fulfills his promise, that God is faithful to his promises, that he works out his promises in his own time, in his own way. We see this in the battle plan for Jericho. This isn't good military strategy. This is God fulfilling his promises. We see this in how God gives his people victory over much more powerful armies, over massive armies that were lined up against them. Joshua 10:42, after the conquest of this coalition of kings, Joshua 10:42 says, "And Joshua captured all these kings and their land at one time, because the Lord, the God of Israel, fought for Israel." Right? So Joshua is successful not because he's wise, not because he's great, but because the Lord fought for them. We also see, so God fulfills his promises. We also see that God takes sin deadly seriously. That God takes sin deadly seriously. So we see this in the judgment on the Canaanites. And so we just see the seriousness there of God's judgment, of God's holiness, and of human sin. So God fulfills his promises, and God takes sin deadly seriously. Then in Judges, basically we just see kind of one simple idea. To be a faithful people, Israel needs a faithful king. To be a faithful people, Israel needs a faithful king. Tom Schreiner, in his book, The King in His Beauty, makes this comment. He says, just kind of overviewing the whole book of Judges, says, "A new generation dawns with the book of Judges. On the heels of the book of Joshua, we wonder if Israel will be faithful to the covenant that was reaffirmed at the conclusion of Joshua. For it is clear that Israel will prosper only if they obey their covenant Lord and King. 2/3 of the promise made with Abraham had been fulfilled. Israel enjoyed a large population, and they inhabited the land of Canaan. But would they bless the whole world? Would the universal blessing promised to Abraham become a reality through them?" The book of Judges dashes any hopes that worldwide blessing would come anytime soon through Israel. Yeah, I just appreciate that quote again. It just makes, it highlights that kind of threefold promise thing, and again emphasizes that the first two have been accomplished: the population, the land, check, check. But are the people of Israel going to be this worldwide blessing or not? Judges would suggest that not anytime soon. Not anytime soon. And we see that really through those repeated refrains that we saw earlier. Israel did what is evil in the eyes of the Lord. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times in the book of Judges. And everyone did what was right in his own eyes. That's 2 more times in the book of Judges. And then 1, 2, 3, 4 times we see, in those days there was no king in Israel. So the problem is that Israel was doing what was evil in the eyes of the Lord. Israel was doing kind of whatever they felt like made the most sense to them. They were living their truth. They were following their heart. They were doing all those things, and it was all wicked in the eyes of the Lord. Why? Because they didn't have a king. Because they didn't have a king. Okay, so redemption. What do we see about redemption? Basically, both of these are basically a study in faithfulness versus unfaithfulness. A study in faithfulness versus unfaithfulness. And what makes the difference? What causes the people to be faithful or unfaithful? At the end of the day, it comes down to the king. Is there going to be a Joshua to lead the people into faithfulness or no? Is there going to be a king, a faithful king, to lead the people into faithfulness or no? So Israel will be blessed insofar as they are faithful, and they will be faithful insofar as they have a good king, and they will have a good king insofar as he is yielded to the Lord. So redemption. One thing to note that's interesting, Joshua has the same name as Jesus. Joshua has the same name as Jesus. Both, so Joshua is kind of the English version, and Jesus is basically the Greek version, but both come from the Hebrew Yeshua. So they both kind of have the same root name. So there's this connection that Jesus makes in Matthew chapter 11, where so for Joshua, throughout the book of Joshua, you start to see you see consistently this picture that what God describes giving them the land, he describes it as giving them rest in the land. That through Joshua, God is going to give them rest in the land. And then Jesus touches on this in Matthew 11, verses 28 through 30, where he says, "Come to me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." I will give you rest. What Joshua was a symbol of is this picture of God through his chosen champion, through Jesus Christ, giving his people rest. Giving his people rest. So then Judges kind of redemptively basically just sets up the need for a king, right? We've hit that already, but just sets up the need for a king. He just sets up this need, not just for a king, but for a redeemer king. A redeemer king is going to lead Israel into faithfulness and to bring about this worldwide blessing, which sets up Samuel and Kings, which sets up the next couple of books that we will jump into next time. So here's the kind of the big question at the end of Judges. How will this Abrahamic promise be fully fulfilled? How will this global blessing come through this people? Okay, so for application, there's really just kind of one observation I want to point out for you. One thing I just want you to notice. So throughout Judges, we see we see a few righteous men, we see several wicked men, and we see a lot of kind of compromised but faithful men. We see a lot of imperfect and compromised and inconsistent yet faithful men. And I think that there's something that we need to wrestle with is that in the book of Judges we see Gideon, who sets up idolatry. We see Barak, who's unwilling to fight the battle unless Deborah comes with him. We see Samson, who just indulges in sexual immorality and foolishness. We see Jephthah, who sacrifices his daughter because of a pagan and foolish vow. We see all of these men. And the book of Hebrews, interestingly, mentions all of them. The book of Hebrews in chapter 11 mentions all of them. And if you're familiar with it, chapter 11 of Hebrews is often called the Hall of Faith, where the author of Hebrews just walks through several heroes from the Old Testament and lifts up kind of their faith and how all that they accomplished through their faith, all the Lord accomplished through their faith through the Old Testament. And he gets to these men. And he doesn't go into detail with them, but he mentions each of them as heroes of the faith. And so I think that needs to condition the way that we see these men. That needs to condition the way that we think about really anyone. The way that we judge ourselves, that we judge others, that we just think about our own inconsistencies and the inconsistencies of others around us. Where we kind of have this tendency where we want to kind of cancel out all the good. We want to cancel out faithfulness. We want to cancel out good in others, whether it's or ourselves or others, our contemporaries or historic figures. We tend to have this desire to almost want to cancel out their good because of their bad. We want to cancel out anything faithful that they've done because of any wicked thing that we want to condemn. But what the scriptures seem to want to do is to say that through faith, your sin is canceled out. That through faith, your failure is canceled out. That through faith, your wickedness, your inconsistency, your inability, your shortcomings are canceled out. And where you are remembered in the book of God is as and for your faith. So even as we see in these men, these stories, these lives, basically examples of how Israel is kind of spiraling down into unfaithfulness, we need to condition that with the redeeming power of Jesus Christ, with the redeeming power of what Jesus has done even for these men. Even in spite of their foolishness, their shortcoming, their kind of unfaithfulness, in their faith, in their zeal to serve the Lord and to live for his kingdom, the Lord honors them for their faith. Well, that's all I have for these two books. Hopefully this is helpful and a blessing. Hopefully this is encouraging. And hopefully, again, this would send you not to skip these books, but to go in and kind of dive a little bit deeper to see what you can get in and from these books. May the Lord bless you. May the Lord encourage you. And may his word be a lamp to your feet and a light to your path.